Hey guys, tonight we begin with something wetter, darker, and far more disgusting than you're prepared for. We're diving into the soggy, sewage-soaked nightmare of Victorian city flooding. Not the cute kind of rain where you grab an umbrella and complain about your hair. I mean the kind of flooding where your entire street turns into a river of human waste, dead animals, and whatever your neighbour tossed out the window before breakfast. The kind of flooding that doesn't knock. It just shows up, fills your basement with things you never want to identify, and leaves behind a smell that haunts your walls for the next 6 months. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Let us pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what happened when it rained in a city that had no storm drains, no flood defences, and roughly 200,000 people sharing a river they also used as a toilet? Have you ever thought about what it was like to live in a basement apartment when 6 inches of raw sewage came bubbling up through your floorboards at 3 in the morning? Could you survive a night trapped in a cellar while the Thames rose high enough to float your dining table? Would you drink the water afterward? Would you drink it before? Did anyone in Victorian England actually enjoy the rain, or did they just stand at the window whispering prayers and holding their boots? And what happens when a brand new dam, built with great confidence and moderate engineering skill, decides to simply stop being a dam at midnight on a Friday? How do you outrun 700 million gallons of water in the dark, in your nightshirt, with no shoes and no warning? Congratulations, you have just woken up in London. The year is 1858. The river smells like the end of the world, your ceiling is dripping, and something in the cellar just moved. Good luck. To understand why Victorian cities flooded so catastrophically, you first need to understand what Victorian cities actually were, and what they were, frankly, was a mess. Between 1800 and 1850, Britain's population didn't just grow, it exploded. Millions of people left the countryside and crammed into cities like London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham, chasing factory jobs and the vague promise of a better life. What they found instead were streets so narrow 2 people could barely pass each other without a formal apology, buildings stacked on top of buildings and drainage systems that had been designed for a village of 1,200, not a heaving metropolis of 2 million. As you step farther into the city, the first thing you notice is not what you see, but what you smell. Coal smoke hangs low enough to sting your eyes before breakfast. Horse manure bakes slowly into the cobblestones. Open drains contribute their own unforgettable personality to the air, while smoke from thousands of chimneys settles over everything like a damp grey blanket. You inhale because, unfortunately, breathing remains one of those unavoidable habits. Victorian London offers plenty of opportunities to reconsider that decision. The noise arrives next. Iron-rimmed wagon wheels clatter over uneven stones. Horses snort impatiently, while drivers shout themselves hoarse. Factory whistles interrupt the morning with military precision, reminding everyone that time belongs to the machines now. Somewhere nearby, a street vendor advertises hot pies with remarkable optimism, considering the aroma competing for your attention. Every sound echoes between rows of brick buildings packed so tightly together that sunlight often struggles to negotiate visiting rights. The city itself had not been planned for this. Most British cities grew piece by piece over centuries, rather than springing from some grand design. Medieval lanes that once handled a few carts each day suddenly carried endless traffic. Tiny streams disappeared beneath roads. Ditches were covered over to make room for new construction. Every available patch of land seemed destined to become another row of houses, another warehouse, another factory, or another place where someone could pay rent for the privilege of living dangerously close to everyone else. You quickly discover that open space has become an expensive luxury. Children play wherever they can find a few square feet that are not already occupied by carts, livestock, or puddles of suspicious origin. Laundry stretches between buildings like surrender flags. Chickens wander freely through alleys. Dogs inspect piles of refuse with professional dedication. If modern city planners talk about mixed-use development, Victorian cities interpreted that as people, animals, industry, and waste sharing the exact same square yard. The ground beneath your boots tells its own story. Rainwater has nowhere particularly useful to go because so much of the natural soil has disappeared beneath stone, brick, and packed earth. Long before anyone spoke about permeable surfaces or urban runoff, Victorian builders unknowingly created enormous hard landscapes that encouraged every drop of rain to hurry directly into streets and drains. Unfortunately, those drains had already surrendered. This becomes easier to understand when you picture the older drainage systems. Many had evolved gradually over generations. Some consisted of simple brick channels. Others were little more than covered ditches carrying wastewater toward nearby rivers. They functioned tolerably well when serving a modest town. Then the town multiplied several times over, without giving its underground infrastructure much say in the matter. Imagine inviting 12 friends for dinner, only to have 2,000 arrive instead. The dining table would become crowded rather quickly. Victorian drainage experienced essentially the same problem, except instead of awkward conversations about seating arrangements, it involved overflowing sewage. Progress occasionally lacks polish. The authorities did attempt improvements from time to time, but growth consistently outran construction. Every year brought more workers, more families, more workshops, and more demand for housing. New neighbourhoods appeared with astonishing speed. Builders often prioritised getting roofs overhead rather than wondering where rainwater might travel during the next storm. That question belonged firmly in the category of someone else's future problem. As you wander through one of these neighbourhoods, you notice how many homes possess basements or cellars. These spaces store coal, food, tools, or anything else a household cannot fit upstairs. They also happen to occupy the lowest point of the property, making them remarkably enthusiastic collectors of unwanted water. The moment heavy rain begins, gravity starts making decisions on your behalf. Even before flooding arrives, dampness is a constant companion. Brick walls sweat during wet weather. Wooden beams absorb moisture until they creak softly through the night. Wallpaper curls away from plaster. Blankets never seem entirely dry. If your socks stay dry for an entire afternoon, you begin suspecting witchcraft. Then there are the rivers. Cities like London owed much of their existence to waterways that provided transport, trade and fresh water, long before railways dominated the landscape. The Thames carried ships loaded with goods from around the world. Smaller tributaries threaded through neighbourhoods before many of them vanished beneath expanding streets. Yet rivers possess an inconvenient habit of remembering where they used to flow. Floodplains had once absorbed excess water naturally. Marshes slowed rising rivers. Open fields soaked up heavy rainfall. Urban expansion steadily erased these natural safety valves beneath brick, mortar, warehouses, and crowded housing. The water did not disappear simply because people preferred not to think about it. It merely waited for an opportunity to remind everyone that geography cannot be argued with. Rain itself rarely arrives as the true villain. Britain has always experienced wet weather. The real problem lies in what the city has become. Every shower lands upon roofs, streets, courtyards, and factory yards before rushing downhill together. Tiny streams become torrents. Gutters overflow almost immediately. Water searches relentlessly for lower ground. And unfortunately, you happen to live there. You might expect someone to have noticed this pattern after the first dozen floods. They absolutely did. Newspapers complained. Residents complained. Doctors complained. Engineers produced reports thick enough to stop a door. Local officials held meetings, debated budgets, formed committees, and occasionally commissioned another report to explain the previous report. Bureaucracy, it turns out, remains one of history's most flood-resistant structures. Meanwhile, ordinary families adapted as best they could. Furniture sat on bricks whenever rain threatened. Important papers were kept upstairs. Children learned which streets disappeared first during storms. Shopkeepers watched dark clouds with the same concern modern people reserve for software updates that promise to fix everything while quietly breaking 3 other things instead. Insurance offered little comfort for many working families because replacing possessions cost money they simply did not have. A flooded mattress might represent months of savings. Spoiled food meant hunger. Waterlogged fuel meant cold evenings. Every flood reached beyond inconvenience into the mathematics of survival, where one ruined week could echo through an entire season. The factories suffered as well. Floodwater halted machinery, damaged raw materials, and interrupted production schedules. Owners worried about profits, workers worried about wages. Neither group appreciated rivers suddenly visiting the workplace uninvited. The Thames consistently ignored appointment calendars. The remarkable part is how normal all of this gradually became. People discussed flooded streets the way modern commuters discuss traffic jams. Boots became essential equipment rather than fashionable accessories. Children accepted overflowing gutters as ordinary features of urban life. Humans possess an extraordinary ability to normalize almost anything if exposed to it long enough, even when that anything smells profoundly offensive. As evening approaches, gas lamps flicker against damp brick walls while mist creeps through narrow streets. Rain begins tapping gently across rooftops once again. You hear it first as a pleasant patter before remembering exactly where all that water intends to go. Somewhere beneath your feet, aging brick drains prepare for another exhausting night far beyond their intended capacity. And that is the real secret of Victorian flooding. The storms were only part of the story. The cities had quietly engineered their own disaster, expanding faster than common sense, burying streams, paving floodplains, overwhelming ancient drains, and trusting that tomorrow would somehow sort itself out. Tomorrow, as it usually did, arrived carrying an umbrella and a great deal of regret. Before the great Victorian sewer projects, most cities had no centralised drainage. What they had instead was a collection of ancient ditches, open gutters, and the kind of optimism that only comes from never having seen a flood map. Rainwater ran wherever gravity told it to. Sometimes that was the gutter. Sometimes that was your kitchen. And because these same gutters also carried human waste, animal remains, and the runoff from slaughterhouses and tanneries, a good downpour didn't just flood your street, it seasoned it. As you continue your walk through the city, you begin paying closer attention to what lies beneath your feet. At first glance, the gutters look almost respectable. Narrow channels run alongside the cobbles, carrying a sluggish stream of murky water toward the nearest river. Respectable, however, is doing an extraordinary amount of work here. The liquid moving past your boots has been collecting contributions from kitchens, privies, workshops, stables, breweries, and just about anywhere else that produces something nobody wishes to keep. Every household participates whether it means to or not. A maid empties a bucket into the gutter. A butcher rinses yesterday's blood from his chopping block. A stable boy shovels manure into the nearest ditch with all the confidence of someone who knows it is no longer his problem. Soap, ashes, grease, spoiled vegetables, coal dust, broken crockery, and things that nobody bothers identifying all join the same slow procession toward the river. Recycling had not yet become fashionable. Everything simply became somebody else's downstream surprise. If you happen to arrive after several dry days, the gutters barely move at all. Thick deposits cling stubbornly to the brickwork. The smell hangs motionless in the still air, rising gently whenever the afternoon sun warms the streets. You instinctively breathe through your mouth before realizing that this somehow makes the experience even worse. Victorian cities possessed an uncanny ability to make every available breathing option feel incorrect. Then the rain begins. At first it sounds almost pleasant. Soft drops tap against slate roofs. Water trickles from overflowing gutters attached to houses. Shopkeepers glance skyward but continue sweeping their doorsteps. Children splash through the first puddles because children across every century share an unwavering commitment to making sensible footwear entirely pointless. The trouble is that these drains were never designed to separate clean rainwater from filthy waste. In many places there was no distinction at all. Everything occupied the same channels, the same ditches, and ultimately the same rivers. Nature had created something beautifully straightforward called downhill. Victorian sanitation added an astonishing amount of biological complexity. As the water level rises, the contents of the gutters become increasingly ambitious. Straw floats past first, followed by cabbage leaves and bits of firewood. Soon there are clumps of horse manure bobbing cheerfully through the current like unpleasant little boats. Chickens flap awkwardly onto doorsteps to escape the rising flow. Rats, sensing that events have become inconvenient even by their standards, scramble for higher ground. You begin noticing something else. The water is no longer flowing neatly toward the river. Instead, it hesitates, slows, then starts moving in directions that seem physically offensive. Ancient drains become clogged with debris. Narrow culverts cannot carry the sudden volume. Water backs up through side channels, emerging from places where water has absolutely no business making an appearance. A nearby cellar is first to surrender. You hear shouts from below street level as someone realizes the floor has disappeared beneath several inches of brown water. Coal bins begin floating, wooden barrels tip onto their sides, potatoes drift lazily across the room with an air of complete innocence. Somewhere a family desperately tries lifting furniture, while simultaneously wondering whether it is still technically furniture after floating. Cellars suffered particularly because they occupied the lowest part of the house. Many working-class families even lived in basement rooms, paying rent for accommodation that effectively doubled as a collection basin every time the weather became ambitious. Imagine paying monthly rent for an apartment whose greatest architectural feature is its ability to become part of the local river system. Estate agents today might still describe it as having excellent water access. Outside, the streets become almost impossible to navigate. Horse-drawn carts create waves that slap against front doors. Pedestrians cling to walls searching for patches of slightly shallower water. Boots disappear beneath the muddy surface, occasionally refusing to return without negotiation. Every step carries the thrilling uncertainty of not knowing whether you have found solid ground or simply a deeper section of everyone else's problems. The city's trades contribute their own unique ingredients. Near the slaughterhouses, rain sweeps away blood, scraps, and animal waste. Around the tanneries, chemicals used for processing leather wash into the streets alongside foul-smelling organic matter. Breweries release spilled grain and yeast. Markets contribute rotting fruit, wilted vegetables, fish remains, and enough cabbage leaves to convince future archaeologists that Victorians worshipped lettuce. None of these industries intended to poison the streets. They simply existed in astonishing proximity to homes, because Victorian zoning laws were considerably less interested in separating unpleasant activities from ordinary life. You could purchase fresh bread while standing within smelling distance of a tannery, capable of stripping the optimism from an entire neighbourhood. Eventually everything sought the rivers. The Thames became London's greatest highway and its greatest victim. Countless drains emptied directly into it. Smaller streams carried waste into larger streams until nearly every drop found its way downstream. During heavy rain, the river itself rose higher, slowing the outflow from city drains. Suddenly, the water had nowhere left to escape, so it returned. This is perhaps the most insulting part of the entire arrangement. After spending all day trying to leave the city, the water simply changed its mind and came back carrying everything it had collected along the way. It was less a drainage system than an extremely unpleasant boomerang. You would think people might avoid touching floodwater altogether. They certainly tried. But avoiding it became remarkably difficult when it covered entire streets, seeped into homes, surrounded workplaces, and occasionally occupied the same room as your dinner. Daily life continued because stopping entirely was rarely an option. Factory workers still needed wages. Shopkeepers still opened their doors. Deliveries still had to be made, even if the delivery route now resembled an amateur attempt at building Venice. Doctors of the period often blamed disease on foul air, believing poisonous smells carried illness. They were mistaken about the mechanism, but not entirely about the danger. The water itself frequently contained bacteria from human waste, contaminating wells, pumps, and other water sources. Long before germs became widely understood, entire neighbourhoods found themselves drinking water that had recently enjoyed a deeply personal relationship with the local sewer. There is a certain tragic efficiency to it all. The same rain that should have washed the city clean instead gathered every imaginable contaminant, mixed everything together with remarkable thoroughness, and redistributed the result directly into people's homes. Modern washing machines offer multiple cycles. Victorian flooding preferred one setting called absolutely everything. Municipal officials recognised that something had gone terribly wrong, but solutions proved expensive. Digging entirely new sewer systems beneath crowded cities required enormous engineering effort, political agreement, and astonishing amounts of money. Those three ingredients rarely arrived together at precisely the right moment. So the old gutters remained. Workers scraped mud from the streets after each flood. Residents scrubbed floors, dried bedding, and aired out damp walls. Shopkeepers replace spoiled goods. Children returned to playing once the water receded, somehow accepting that yesterday's miniature river had carried things no childhood memory should include. As the rain finally eases, the current slows once more. Puddles remain trapped between uneven cobblestones. The smell lingers with impressive determination, as though reluctant to admit the storm has ended. You wipe your boots against the nearest step, achieving nothing except redistributing history into a slightly thinner layer. And that was the genius of Victorian drainage before the great sewer reforms. Water always found somewhere to go. It simply possessed an extraordinary talent for choosing every single place it absolutely should not have gone, proving once again that gravity is reliable. But human planning occasionally needs a second draft. Under nearly every Victorian house sat a cesspit, a hole in the ground where all your household waste collected slowly, patiently, and with a fragrance that could strip paint. In theory, a night soil man would come around every few weeks, scoop out the worst of it, and cart it away. In practice, the cesspits overflowed constantly, especially when it rained, because when the water table rose, those underground pits didn't just sit there politely. They pushed back. Sewage would seep up through cellar floors, bubble through cracks in the foundations, and occasionally announce itself by erupting into the living quarters like a deeply unwelcome houseguest. As you leave the flooded streets behind for a moment, you discover that the greatest danger is not always outside your front door. Sometimes it's directly beneath your feet, quietly waiting with remarkable patience. Victorian homes had an unfortunate habit of concealing their worst ideas underground, and the cesspit was undoubtedly one of them. It was less a feat of engineering than an agreement to let tomorrow deal with today's unpleasantness. If you lived in a respectable house before modern sewers became widespread, your lavatory usually emptied into this underground chamber. Every visit contributed another small installment to an ever-growing reservoir of human waste. Day after day, week after week, the pit slowly filled while everyone upstairs tried very hard not to think about it. Ignoring problems buried beneath your property is an ancient human tradition. Unfortunately, gravity also enjoys traditions. Most cesspits were lined with brick, although the quality varied enormously. Wealthier households could afford better construction, while poorer districts often made do with pits that leaked almost from the day they were dug. Even well-built cesspits were never intended to last forever. Mortar cracked, brick shifted, tree roots squeezed into tiny gaps. Before long, liquids escaped into the surrounding soil whether anyone approved or not. You may begin wondering why anyone thought this was acceptable. The honest answer is that for centuries it often seemed good enough. In smaller towns with fewer people and more open ground, cesspits could function reasonably well if emptied regularly. The trouble came when villages transformed into enormous industrial cities almost overnight. Suddenly, thousands upon thousands of underground pits were quietly filling beneath tightly packed neighbourhoods, each one conducting its own slow experiment in public sanitation. Your nose notices the consequences long before your eyes do. Even on dry days, certain streets carry a sour, earthy odour that never entirely disappears. It drifts from basement vents, seeps through cracked paving stones, and lingers in enclosed courtyards where fresh air rarely wins the battle. Residents become astonishingly skilled at pretending not to notice. Human beings can adapt to almost anything given enough time, including aromas that would cause a modern building inspector to resign on the spot. When the weather remains dry, the contents of a cesspit usually stay where they are supposed to stay, more or less. Solids settle toward the bottom. Liquids slowly soak into the surrounding ground. It is hardly elegant, but it remains mostly hidden. Victorian sanitation depended heavily on the comforting illusion that invisible problems had somehow stopped existing. Then dark clouds gather. The first rain seems harmless enough. Water trickles from roofs and splashes into the street. You might even welcome the cooler air after several humid days. Neighbours glance skyward with cautious optimism, hoping for enough rain to settle the dust, but not enough to create another disaster. Unfortunately, the clouds have already committed themselves to a different sort of entertainment. Hour after hour, rain soaks into the earth. The soil beneath the city becomes saturated until it can absorb no more. Groundwater begins rising silently through layers of clay, gravel, and sand. You never see it happening. There is no dramatic warning, no polite knock on the cellar door. Nature simply starts lifting everything from below. The water table creeps upward until it reaches the cesspit itself. Now an underground chamber that was already nearly full suddenly finds itself under pressure from every direction. Water seeps through tiny cracks in the brickwork. The contents begin rising. Air trapped inside searches desperately for somewhere to escape. Eventually the pressure becomes greater than the surrounding foundations were ever meant to withstand. That is when your house decides to participate. A damp patch appears across the cellar floor. Perhaps you ignore it at first. Basements are supposed to be damp after all. Then another patch appears. Soon the mortar between the stones begins weeping murky brown water. Tiny bubbles emerge through cracks with surprising confidence. The smell grows noticeably stronger, removing any lingering mystery about the liquid's identity. You spend several hopeful minutes convincing yourself it might simply be muddy rainwater, before your nose firmly rejects that theory. Within hours, the floor resembles a shallow pond. Coal stacked neatly in one corner becomes soaked. Firewood absorbs moisture until it burns about as enthusiastically as wet bread. Storage crates float gently away from the walls. Anything resting directly on the floor begins absorbing contaminated water through wood, cloth, or leather. Victorian waterproof containers generally consisted of crossing your fingers. If your family actually lives in the cellar, matters become considerably worse. Throughout the 19th century, many poorer families rented basement rooms because they cost less than upper floors. These cramped spaces were already dark, damp, and poorly ventilated before flooding entered the conversation. Rain transformed them into something resembling an accidental indoor marsh. Beds stood in contaminated water. Blankets remained permanently clammy. Every object carried the lingering smell of sewage no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove. You try sleeping while listening to mysterious gurgling sounds beneath the floorboards. Every few minutes another bubble rises somewhere nearby with all the confidence of a soup pot approaching a boil. The walls sweat. Candles flicker in stale air. Somewhere behind the bricks comes the faint sloshing of thousands of gallons doing exactly what physics insists they should. Relaxing bedtime ambience takes many forms. This one never quite caught on. Even wealthier households escaped only by degree rather than entirely. Servants often worked in basement kitchens where food was prepared for the entire household. Imagine attempting to bake fresh bread while wondering whether the puddle approaching across the floor technically counts as an ingredient. Victorian cookbooks remained surprisingly silent on this point. The night soil men deserve a brief moment of appreciation because they inherited perhaps the least glamorous profession in the city. Their task was to empty cesspits manually. Usually at night when streets were quieter and respectable, society preferred not to witness the mechanics of sanitation. Armed with buckets, shovels, carts, and astonishing tolerance, they removed waste that nobody else wished to acknowledge. It was difficult, filthy work. Unfortunately, there were never enough of them. The population expanded faster than the waste could be collected. Many cesspits waited weeks or months beyond their intended emptying schedule. Some property owners delayed paying for the service altogether, hoping to save money by waiting just a little longer. Human optimism has always included the belief that overflowing containers somehow possess one more week of capacity. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they absolutely did not. Overflowing cesspits also contaminated nearby wells. This created one of the cruelest ironies of Victorian urban life. The same household might draw drinking water from only a few yards away from the underground pit, receiving all of its waste. Invisible contamination spread quietly through groundwater long before anyone fully understood bacteria. People blamed foul smells, bad air, unfortunate weather, or simple bad luck, while the real culprit patiently dissolved into the water supply. The city became an intricate underground network of leaking pits, cracked drains, shallow wells, and saturated soil. Everything connected in ways nobody had intentionally designed. One household's sanitation problem gradually became the neighbourhood's sanitation problem. During heavy rain, the entire district collaborated in producing an outcome that nobody actually wanted. Eventually, the storm passes. The water table slowly falls again. Floodwater drains away. The bubbling subsides. Residents scrub floors with buckets of clean water that somehow still feel inadequate for the task. Windows remain open despite the cold, in a determined effort to persuade the smell to leave. It rarely hurries. Days later, the cellar still feels damp beneath your boots. The walls retain dark stains marking just how high the water reached. Wooden furniture begins warping. Mould quietly establishes itself in forgotten corners. The memory of the flood lingers long after the puddles disappear, leaving every rainfall from then onward feeling less like weather and more like a personal threat. And that was the true genius of the Victorian cesspit. It transformed your own home into the final stage of the city's sanitation system, then waited patiently for the rain to reverse the entire process. Modern houses occasionally surprise you with a leaking pipe. Victorian houses preferred the far more dramatic option of having the basement burp. In Victorian slums, the worst accommodation was always the cellar, not a cosy finished basement with a television and a dehumidifier. A damp, lightless hole dug into the earth beneath a crumbling tenement, where an entire family might eat, sleep, and slowly decompose alongside whatever moisture the ground decided to share with them. Social investigators found families of 10 or 12 living in these underground rooms with no ventilation, no natural light, and walls permanently slick with condensation. As you step down the narrow wooden stairs into one of these cellar dwellings, the first thing you notice is the air. It is thick, cold, and heavy enough to feel like it has been sitting there for years waiting for someone new to arrive. The smell is a mixture of damp brick, coal smoke, spoiled food, human waste, and the unmistakable scent of a room that has rarely experienced anything as luxurious as fresh air. You lower your head because the ceiling is often too close to stand comfortably. The walls press inward. The floor feels cold beneath your boots because the earth itself is only a few feet away. During summer, the room traps humidity like a sealed jar. During winter, it becomes a stone box that seems personally offended by the concept of warmth. This was not a temporary inconvenience for many working-class families. This was home. As industrial cities expanded during the 19th century, thousands of workers needed somewhere affordable to sleep after long days in factories, mills, workshops, and docks. Landlords understood this demand perfectly. If there was a space that could technically fit a human being, someone would eventually decide it could probably be rented. A cellar became a room because someone added a door. That was often the entire business model. You might imagine a basement apartment today and picture exposed brick walls, warm lighting, and expensive furniture arranged carefully to create an atmosphere of urban sophistication. Victorian cellar housing offered a different aesthetic. The theme was less modern industrial charm and more accidental cave inhabited by exhausted people. Windows, when they existed, were usually small openings positioned at street level. Instead of looking out over a pleasant garden or city skyline, you looked directly at passing boots, muddy wheels, and whatever happened to fall through the gap above. Your greatest view of the outside world was occasionally a horse losing an argument with the road. Natural light was almost non-existent. Candles and oil lamps provided what little illumination families could afford. Every extra hour of artificial light cost money, meaning darkness was not just an inconvenience, but an unavoidable part of daily life. Evening activities were limited. Reading became difficult. Sewing became harder. Children grew up in rooms where the difference between afternoon and midnight was sometimes simply whether someone remembered to light a candle. The dampness was the constant companion. Moisture entered through the floor, walls, and foundations. Rainwater from the street above seeped downward. Rising groundwater pushed upward. Condensation formed whenever warm human bodies attempted to heat the cold underground air. The cellar fought every attempt at comfort with the determination of a landlord collecting overdue rent. You might try drying clothes inside, but the room itself was already struggling to dry. Laundry hung from lines across the ceiling, slowly releasing moisture back into the same air everyone was breathing. Bedding remained cold and clammy. Wooden furniture absorbed water until it began to warp. Even the walls seemed to sweat. Modern people complain when a hotel room has poor ventilation. Victorian cellar residents lived inside what was essentially a permanent ventilation complaint. And then came the floods. Because these homes were already below street level, they were often the first places affected when rain overwhelmed the city. Water did not need to break through doors or climb stairs. It simply followed the path gravity had kindly prepared. The street above collected rainfall, the gutters overflowed, drains backed up, water found cracks in foundations and gaps around doors. Within hours, the cellar floor that served as a family's living space became a shallow pool. You wake in the middle of the night to the sound of dripping. At first it is just one drop, then another, then the unmistakable sound of water spreading where water should not be. A family scrambles to lift possessions off the floor. Bedding is dragged onto chairs. Food supplies are moved higher. Wooden boxes are stacked wherever possible. There is no storage room upstairs because there is no upstairs that belongs to you. Everything valuable must be protected in the same tiny space where everything else is already happening. The cruel irony is that the people most vulnerable to flooding were often those least able to escape it. A wealthy resident could temporarily relocate. A middle-class family might afford repairs. A poor family living in a cellar had far fewer choices. Moving meant finding another affordable room, paying another deposit, and leaving behind whatever possessions the flood had not already damaged. So you stayed, you cleaned, you waited. You hoped the next storm would be kinder. The problem was that Victorian cities experienced repeated flooding because the causes were built into the environment itself. Poor drainage, crowded construction, polluted waterways and underground waste systems combined into a perfect recipe for misery. A cellar resident did not simply experience a flood. They experienced the city revealing every mistake it had buried. Social reformers who investigated these neighbourhoods often described shocking conditions. They found overcrowding, poor sanitation, and families living in spaces never intended for long-term habitation. Entire households shared rooms with barely enough space for beds, cooking equipment, and personal belongings. Privacy was practically non-existent. A family of 8 might sleep in shifts because there were not enough beds. Parents, children, and relatives occupied the same damp room. The idea of personal space belonged to a different world entirely. Modern arguments about sharing a bedroom with a sibling suddenly seem much less dramatic when compared with an entire household sharing one underground chamber. Even worse, children growing up in these conditions had little escape. The streets outside offered more space but brought their own dangers. Inside was dark and unhealthy. Outside was crowded, polluted, and often flooded. You were effectively choosing between different varieties of unpleasantness. The city itself became a machine that concentrated hardship into certain areas. Wealthier districts often had better housing, improved drainage, and more political influence. Poorer neighbourhoods received the consequences of rapid growth without the benefits. When floods arrived, they exposed these inequalities with uncomfortable efficiency. Water always finds the lowest point. Unfortunately, in Victorian cities, the lowest point was often where the poorest people lived. The situation gradually began to change as engineers improved sewer systems, public health officials pushed for reforms, and governments finally accepted that allowing millions of people to live above overflowing waste pits was perhaps not the strongest foundation for a modern society. But progress came slowly. For many years, the cellar remained a grim reality beneath the busy streets. Above ground, cities celebrated industry, invention, and progress. Factories produced goods. Railways expanded. Buildings climbed higher. Below ground, families battled damp walls and rising water. It was a strange contradiction of the Victorian age. The same century that produced incredible engineering achievements also tolerated living conditions that made a flooded cellar seem almost inevitable. Eventually the rain stops. The water retreats. The street above returns to normal. Carriages roll past. Shopkeepers reopen. People continue their daily routines as though the city has not just attempted to turn their homes into underground ponds. But beneath those streets, you remember the truth. Victorian cities were built upward with ambition and downward with neglect. And when the rain came hard enough, the people living closest to the ground discovered the unfortunate rule of urban flooding. Water does not care about your rent, your occupation, or your plans for tomorrow. It simply goes wherever the city has already made room for it. And apparently, Victorian builders had made plenty of room. By the middle of the 19th century, the River Thames was not a river in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a sewer, a vast, slow-moving channel of human waste, industrial runoff, animal carcasses, and the occasional abandoned piece of furniture, all churning together beneath the bridges of the greatest city on earth. Flush toilets, which were becoming wildly popular among the middle classes, only made things worse. Every new toilet connected to the old sewer system, which drained directly into the Thames. As you stand beside the river on a warm Victorian afternoon, you expect to see one of the great symbols of British power. The Thames is supposed to represent trade, empire, and progress. It carries ships from distant countries, supplies factories with materials, and cuts through the heart of London like a proud natural highway. Instead, you notice the smell first. It arrives before the view has a chance to impress you. The odour rises from the water with remarkable confidence. It is thick, sour, and impossible to ignore. You take one breath and immediately understand why residents along the river developed a talent for walking quickly. The Thames may have been the lifeblood of London, but by the mid-19th century it had also become the place where the city sent everything it preferred not to think about. And London had a lot not to think about. Millions of people depended on the river, but the city had grown faster than its understanding of sanitation. Every day, waste flowed into the Thames from thousands of homes, businesses, and industries. The river became the final destination for almost every unpleasant byproduct of urban life. Human waste was only the beginning. Factories released chemicals and industrial leftovers. Tanneries dumped waste from leather production. Slaughterhouses contributed animal remains and organic matter. Household rubbish washed into drains and eventually reached the water. The Thames became less like a river and more like a giant moving record of every terrible decision a city could make. The most impressive part was that people still had to use it. The river remained essential for transportation and commerce. Barges carried coal, timber, food, and manufactured goods. Fishermen worked its waters. Workers crossed its bridges every day. The same river that carried the city's waste also supported the city's economy. It was a remarkable arrangement. Imagine running a restaurant where the kitchen, bathroom, garbage disposal and dining area all share the same table. Victorian London essentially looked at that concept and decided it was worth scaling up. For centuries the Thames had been used as a convenient place to dispose of unwanted material. Before modern sewer systems, this seemed practical. Rivers moved water away, and moving water appeared capable of carrying away problems. Unfortunately, the city eventually produced more waste than the river could handle. The Thames was not failing. It was being asked to perform an impossible job. The arrival of flush toilets added another layer to the problem. To the Victorian middle class, the flush toilet seemed like a miracle of modern comfort. No more chamber pots, no more unpleasant smells inside the home. A simple pull of a handle and your problem disappeared. At least that was the idea. The problem was that the problem did not disappear. It simply moved somewhere else. Every new toilet required somewhere for the waste to go. In a modern city, that means carefully designed sewer networks and treatment facilities. In Victorian London, it often meant sending everything into existing drains that were already struggling to cope. So the flush toilet did not remove waste. It introduced a more efficient delivery system. You could almost admire the confidence. London had invented a machine that allowed thousands of people to send their waste away instantly, without first checking whether the destination was prepared for millions of new arrivals. It was the 19th century equivalent of creating a massive online shopping system and realizing afterward that nobody had built the roads. During heavy rain, the situation became even worse. The Thames was already carrying enormous amounts of waste. Then storms arrived and pushed additional water through the city's drainage system. Older sewers overflowed, sending mixtures of rainwater and sewage directly into streets and homes. The river rose higher, reducing the ability of drains to empty properly. The result was a city trapped in a cycle. Rain filled the streets filled the drains filled the river. The overflowing river pushed back against the drains, and suddenly London discovered that everything was connected, usually in the least pleasant way possible. The summer of 1858 became the most infamous example of the Thames condition. Known as the Great Stink, the smell became so unbearable that it affected daily life and even forced action from Parliament. The odour from the river was described as overwhelming, with attempts made to cover the smell around government buildings using chemicals. A river had become so offensive that officials tried to defeat it with air freshener. history rarely offers better examples of human optimism. The Great Stink finally convinced many people that something had to change. Scientists and engineers had already been arguing for improvements, but the crisis created the political pressure needed to act. The city could tolerate many problems, but when the river outside Parliament became impossible to ignore, suddenly sanitation became a priority. The response was one of the greatest engineering projects of the Victorian era. New sewer systems were designed to carry waste away from populated areas and prevent it from flowing directly into the Thames. Engineers created underground networks stretching beneath the city, transforming the relationship between London and its river. The changes were enormous. The Thames slowly began recovering. It would take decades, but the worst of the pollution gradually decreased. Fish returned. The smell improved. The river became something closer to what people imagined it should have been all along. But before that transformation, you have to understand what it meant to live beside the Thames during its darkest years. Every day began with the knowledge that the city's greatest natural feature was also its largest waste channel. Workers crossed bridges above water they depended on but avoided touching. Boats travelled through currents carrying the remains of daily life. Families drew connections between the river and disease long before modern science fully explained why. The river was beautiful from a distance. Up close, it told a different story. At sunset, the Thames could still look impressive. Gas lamps reflected across the surface. Bridges created dramatic silhouettes against the evening sky. Ships moved slowly through the current. If you stood far enough away and ignored your sense of smell, you might almost believe you were witnessing the height of civilization. Then the wind changed, and the illusion disappeared. The Thames represented the contradiction of Victorian cities perfectly. It was a symbol of achievement and failure at the same time. It carried the wealth of an empire while carrying away the waste of millions. It showed what humans could build, and also what happened when they forgot where all the consequences went. Because that was the real problem with the Victorian Thames. The city believed it had solved the problem of waste by making it invisible. Unfortunately, the river kept excellent records. It collected every mistake, carried every forgotten consequence, and eventually returned the evidence floating right back to the people who created it. The Thames was not just a river. It was London's largest confession, moving slowly beneath the bridges and politely reminding everyone that even the greatest city in the world still had plumbing decisions to regret. Victorian cities were not built to handle serious rainfall. The roads were compacted dirt, cobblestone, or packed mud, none of which absorbed water particularly well. Rooftops funneled rain into gutters that emptied into streets that sloped toward the river, and when the volume of water exceeded what those ancient channels could carry, the whole system simply gave up. Streets turned into streams turned into torrents, and the poorest neighbourhoods, built in the lowest lying areas closest to the water, went under first. As you step outside on a stormy Victorian morning, you quickly realise the city has entered a battle it was never prepared to fight. The first drops tap against rooftops and windows. Shopkeepers pull their goods farther inside. Workers tighten their coats and hurry along the streets, hoping the weather will pass before it becomes a serious inconvenience. Unfortunately, Victorian weather rarely cared about anyone's schedule. A light drizzle could transform into a relentless downpour that seemed determined to test every weakness in the city's design. Rain gathered on rooftops, spilled from overflowing gutters, and rushed downward into streets that were already struggling under the pressure. The city had been built around movement, commerce, and expansion, but very little thought had been given to what happened when the sky decided to empty itself. The answer was simple. Everything got wet. The streets themselves were part of the problem. Modern cities rely on carefully designed drainage systems, smooth roads, and surfaces built to manage water flow. Victorian streets were far less cooperative. Cobblestones created uneven surfaces where puddles formed quickly. Dirt roads became thick mud. Packed earth turned into slippery sludge that grabbed at boots and carriage wheels with impressive determination. Walking through a flooded Victorian street was not a commute. It was an obstacle course designed by someone who disliked shoes. You step carefully, trying to avoid the deepest patches of water, but the city offers no guarantees. One moment your boot lands on a solid stone. The next, it disappears into a hidden hole filled with cold, dirty water. Somewhere nearby, a horse cart passes and sends a wave toward you. demonstrating that Victorian transportation had discovered a new way to inconvenience pedestrians. The horse, of course, remains completely unconcerned. Animals adapted to these conditions better than people did. Horses pulled through flooded roads, though they struggled when water became too deep or the ground beneath became unstable. Their hooves slipped on wet stones. Their carts became heavier. Drivers shouted commands while trying to navigate streets that increasingly resembled shallow rivers. You might wonder why people continued travelling during such conditions. The answer is simple: they had to. Factories did not stop because it rained. Markets still needed deliveries. Workers still needed wages. A flooded street was not a dramatic interruption to life. It was another obstacle added to an already difficult routine. You did not wake up, look outside, and decide that your employer would understand because your road had become a temporary waterway. The Industrial Revolution had created a culture where production continued regardless of inconvenience. Victorian workers were expected to endure long hours, difficult conditions, and occasionally a street full of water attempting to separate them from their workplace. Modern workers complain when a train is delayed by 10 minutes. Victorian workers sometimes had to cross a river that had appeared where the road used to be. The worst affected areas were usually the poorest neighbourhoods. These districts were often located near rivers, docks, and industrial zones, because land there was cheaper and jobs were nearby. Unfortunately, those same locations were also the places most likely to flood. The city had effectively arranged things so that the people with the fewest resources lived where nature had the greatest advantage. As the rain intensified, water moved downhill through the city, following paths that had existed long before houses and streets covered the landscape. Old streams and natural drainage routes had been buried or redirected, but water has an excellent memory. It remembers where it once travelled, even if humans have built a building on top of the route. You begin to see the signs. A gutter overflows. A doorway becomes surrounded by water. A cellar window disappears beneath a rising puddle. Neighbours carry belongings upstairs as quickly as possible, because everyone understands the same uncomfortable truth. Once water enters a home, it rarely arrives alone. Furniture absorbs moisture, food supplies become ruined, bedding becomes unusable, walls begin soaking up water from the ground. A flood does not simply occupy your home, it slowly negotiates with every object inside until everything becomes damp, damaged, or impossible to clean. For families already living close to poverty, this was devastating. A wealthy household could replace damaged furniture. A poor family might lose the few possessions they owned. A flooded room could mean spoiled food, ruined clothing, lost wages, and expensive repairs that nobody had the money to afford. Rain became another form of inequality. The same storm that was a minor inconvenience for one person could be a disaster for another. You might spend the afternoon watching the flood from a dry upstairs window, while your neighbour below is trying to rescue bedding from a flooded room. The difference between safety and disaster could be only a few feet of elevation. Victorian cities were full of these contrasts. Grand buildings stood only streets away from overcrowded neighbourhoods. Wealthy homes had better construction and more space. Poor housing was often built wherever land remained available, which usually meant areas that were less desirable for obvious reasons, like being underwater. As floodwaters spread, the city's normal sounds changed. The usual clatter of wheels against stone became the splash of movement through water. Street vendors shouted from beneath umbrellas. Horses splashed through muddy roads. Rain hammered against windows and rooftops, creating a constant background noise that followed you everywhere. The city itself seemed to slow down, but it never truly stopped. That was the strange reality of Victorian flooding. The disaster was serious, but daily life continued around it. People opened shops beside flooded streets. Children walked through puddles that would horrify modern parents. Workers carried on because the alternative was simply not being paid. Humans are remarkably adaptable. Give someone enough time, and they will normalize almost anything. Eventually, people developed routines around flooding. They knew which streets became impassable first. They knew which houses leaked. They knew which landlords repaired problems and which ones simply meant accepting that the evening plans were probably cancelled. The city had become a place where people lived alongside constant uncertainty. And then there were the storms that went beyond ordinary flooding. The most dangerous rainfall events were not just heavy, they were sudden and overwhelming. A few hours of intense rain could push every weak point in the city's infrastructure at once. Drains overflowed, rivers rose, roads disappeared, homes filled. There was no modern warning system, no emergency alerts, no weather app sending a polite notification telling you that severe flooding was approaching. You simply noticed when the street outside your house started becoming a river. By the time officials understood the scale of the problem, many residents were already dealing with the consequences. Firefighters, police officers, and local authorities attempted to help where they could, but the size of rapidly growing cities made complete protection impossible. The rain had found the city's greatest weakness. It exposed everything hidden beneath the surface: poor planning, overcrowding, aging infrastructure, a belief that yesterday's solutions would somehow survive tomorrow's problems. As the storm finally weakens, the water slowly begins to retreat. Mud remains behind. Streets require cleaning. Homes require repairs. The city resumes its normal rhythm, though everyone knows another storm will eventually arrive. Because Victorian cities had a fascinating relationship with rain. They depended on water for life, industry, and transportation. But when the clouds grew too generous, the same water became an unstoppable reminder that a city could be powerful, wealthy, and technologically advanced while still being completely defeated by a puddle. The Victorians built an empire that stretched across the globe, but for many residents the greatest daily challenge was simply convincing a rainy Tuesday to stay outside. In the summer of 1858, London experienced a heatwave so fierce that the Thames essentially began to cook. Temperatures soared above 35 degrees. The river, already saturated with raw sewage, began to produce a stench so overpowering that it reached the Houses of Parliament. Members of the House of Commons tried soaking the curtains in chloride of lime to block the smell. It did not work. Committees were evacuated. Debates were abandoned. The most powerful legislative body in the world was brought to its knees not by rebellion or war, but by the smell of its own waste. As you approach the banks of the Thames that summer, you immediately understand that something has gone terribly wrong. The river is still moving, technically. It still carries boats, still reflects the sunlight, still cuts through London as it has for centuries. But there is something different about it now, something that makes you hesitate before getting too close. The smell arrives first. It hangs over the city like an invisible fog, thick, rotten, and impossible to escape. It creeps through streets, drifts through open windows, and settles into clothing. You do not simply notice the odour, you experience it. The Thames has become less of a river and more of a terrible announcement that the city has ignored its own plumbing for far too long. The problem had been building for decades. London had grown at a speed that would have impressed anyone watching from the outside. Factories expanded, neighbourhoods multiplied. Millions of people arrived looking for work. The city became the centre of industry, finance, and empire. But while London was busy building railways, factories, and grand buildings, it had neglected something slightly less glamorous: where all the waste went. For years, the answer had been simple: into the river. The Thames had become the final destination for an enormous amount of material. Human waste from cesspits and drains, industrial waste from factories, animal remains from slaughterhouses, household rubbish swept away by rainfall. Everything that the growing city didn't want nearby eventually found its way into the water. The river had spent years quietly collecting London's secrets. By 1858 it had reached its limit. The hot weather made everything worse. Heat accelerated decomposition. Organic matter in the river broke down rapidly, releasing gases that created the unbearable smell. The same sunlight that made the city feel like summer was also turning the Thames into a giant outdoor experiment nobody had volunteered to participate in. You might think people would simply avoid the river. That would have been sensible. Unfortunately, the Thames was too important to avoid. It was still one of the busiest waterways in the world. Ships arrived with goods from across the empire. Workers loaded and unloaded cargo. Boats carried supplies throughout the city. Bridges crossed above it. Businesses depended on it. London could not simply walk away from the Thames. It had built too much around it. So instead, the city did what humans often do when faced with a serious problem. It complained about the smell. Newspapers described the conditions, residents protested, officials discussed the issue, everyone agreed something needed to change. Eventually, the great stink forced that eventually to arrive. The smell became so powerful that even the people who usually had the ability to ignore unpleasant realities were forced to pay attention. Members of Parliament had spent years debating issues affecting the entire empire, from international conflicts to economic policy. Yet suddenly, their greatest challenge was surviving a meeting near a river that had become offensively successful at reminding them where everything went. The attempt to fight the odour with chloride of lime was a perfect example of Victorian determination. The thinking was understandable. Bad smell? Add something stronger. Unfortunately, the Thames had years of experience. A little chemical deodorizer was not going to defeat millions of gallons of decomposing waste. It was the 19th century equivalent of spraying perfume inside a burning kitchen and announcing that the problem had been addressed. Technically, something had been added. Practically, everyone was still aware of the problem. The situation became so uncomfortable that parts of Parliament considered relocating. Workers struggled to remain inside the building. Windows were open despite the summer heat. Curtains were treated with chemicals. Everyone searched for some way to escape an invisible enemy that had arrived directly from the river outside. The irony was difficult to ignore. The same government that had overseen the expansion of one of the world's greatest cities was now being defeated by the consequences flowing beneath it. The Thames had no army, no weapons, no political influence. It simply existed, and yet it managed to create a crisis powerful enough to demand immediate action. The Great Stink also revealed something important about Victorian attitudes towards sanitation. For years, many people understood that city conditions were unpleasant, but unpleasant was not always considered urgent. Poor neighbourhoods had suffered from foul smells, contaminated water, and overflowing waste for generations. These problems were often treated as unfortunate realities of urban life. But when the smell reached Parliament, the issue became impossible to ignore. A problem affecting the poorer citizens had suddenly reached the most powerful rooms in the country, and that changed everything. Public health reformers gained more support. Engineers were given greater authority. The government finally began investing seriously in a modern sewer system capable of handling London's enormous population. The man who would eventually transform London's sanitation was engineer Joseph Bazalgette. His ambitious plans created a network of large underground sewers designed to carry waste away from populated areas and prevent it from flowing directly into the Thames. The project required extraordinary engineering effort, including miles of tunnels, pumping stations, and embankments. It was one of the great achievements of the Victorian age. A city that had accidentally created a river of waste finally began creating a system to manage it. The transformation did not happen overnight. The Thames remained polluted for years afterward. Building infrastructure on this scale required time, money, and enormous labour. But the Great Stink marked a turning point. The city finally accepted that sanitation was not simply a matter of comfort. It was survival. Because the truth was that the smell was not merely unpleasant. It represented a deeper danger. The polluted river contaminated water supplies and contributed to deadly outbreaks of disease. While Victorian scientists did not yet fully understand germ theory, they could see that something about the city's environment was making people sick. The smell was the warning. The disease was the consequence. Standing beside the Thames during that summer, you would have witnessed one of history's strangest moments. A great empire, wealthy beyond imagination, technologically advanced and globally powerful, was forced to confront a problem created by its own success. London had become too large for its old systems. The city had grown upward, outward, and increasingly complicated. But beneath the streets, the infrastructure belonged to another age. The Great Stink was not just a story about an unpleasant river. It was a reminder that progress requires maintenance. You can build magnificent buildings. You can create powerful industries. You can expand across continents. But eventually, someone still has to decide where all the waste goes. And in 1858, London discovered that ignoring that question for long enough would eventually lead to the entire government sitting in a beautiful building, surrounded by expensive furniture, desperately trying to escape the smell coming from the river outside. History has recorded wars, revolutions, and political crises. But few enemies have ever been as democratic as sewage. It reached everyone eventually. If the visible flooding was bad, the invisible aftermath was worse. Victorian doctors believed disease was spread by miasma, bad air, foul smells, the general stink of poverty. They were wrong. Cholera, the most feared killer of the age, was waterborne. It lived in the sewage-contaminated water that flooded streets, seeped into wells, and flowed directly into the drinking supply. The first major cholera epidemic hit London in 1831. As you walk through a Victorian neighbourhood after the floodwaters disappear, the streets appear to be returning to normal. The puddles shrink, the mud dries, shopkeepers sweep away debris, families carry damaged furniture outside and attempt to rescue whatever possessions the water has not claimed. From a distance, the city seems to have survived, but the flood has left something behind, something you cannot see. The most dangerous part of Victorian flooding was not always the water covering the streets. It was what that water carried afterward. Floods acted like a giant mixing system, combining waste from countless sources and spreading it across places where people lived, worked, and collected drinking water. The city had essentially created a delivery network for contamination. Unfortunately, nobody had asked for one. At the time, many doctors believed in the theory of miasma. The idea was simple. Diseases came from poisonous air, especially foul-smelling air produced by rotting material and dirty surroundings. It was not a completely unreasonable belief considering the conditions of Victorian cities. If you walked through a flooded neighbourhood and smelled sewage everywhere, it seemed logical to assume the smell itself was attacking you. The problem was that the smell was only the warning sign. The real danger was much smaller, much harder to detect, and much more difficult to avoid. Cholera bacteria travelled through contaminated water. A person could become infected by drinking water that had been exposed to human waste. The terrifying part was that the water could look perfectly normal, clear, fresh, innocent, which was a rather unfortunate personality trait for something capable of causing deadly outbreaks. You might fill a cup from a local pump, take a drink, and never know that the same underground water source had been quietly connected to overflowing cesspits and leaking drains. Victorian cities had created a situation where cleanliness was often judged by appearance, rather than by what was actually happening beneath the surface. A glass of clear water could still be a terrible idea. Modern people are used to the concept that water should be treated, tested, and carefully managed before reaching the tap. Victorian residents often had no such protection. Many relied on local wells, pumps, or water companies that drew supplies from sources vulnerable to contamination. The city above ground looked impressive. The city below ground was having a much worse experience. During floods, this underground problem became even more serious. Rising water pushed through soil and foundations, carrying contaminants from cesspits and drains into groundwater. Wells located near sources of waste became especially dangerous. A family could unknowingly collect water from a source that had recently received contributions from their own neighbourhood's sanitation problems. It was an arrangement that required an impressive level of confidence, or perhaps simply a lack of alternatives. The cholera outbreaks of the 19th century terrified Victorian communities because of how quickly they spread. A person could appear healthy one day and become seriously ill soon afterward. Families watched entire neighbourhoods affected in a matter of weeks. The disease did not care about wealth, status, or reputation. Although poorer districts suffered heavily because of overcrowding and poor sanitation, cholera eventually reached wealthier areas as well. Contaminated water ignored social boundaries. It did not check whether you lived in a grand townhouse or a cramped cellar before entering your body. For once, everyone was invited. Nobody wanted to attend. The first major cholera outbreak reached Britain in 1831 and 1832. It arrived through trade routes connected to the wider global pandemic and quickly spread through British cities. London, with its crowded neighbourhoods and inadequate sanitation, was especially vulnerable. People were frightened because the disease seemed mysterious. They could see the results, but not the cause. They could smell the polluted environment, but did not understand the invisible organisms responsible. Without knowledge of bacteria, many people focused on cleaning the air instead of cleaning the water. Streets were washed, rooms were aired out, strong smells were used to fight stronger smells. People burned substances they believed would purify the atmosphere. Some of these actions may have made surroundings more pleasant, but they did little against a disease carried through drinking water. It was like trying to stop a leaking roof by polishing the floor. Effort was present. The target was simply incorrect. One of the most important discoveries came through the work of physician John Snow during the 1854 cholera outbreak in London. He studied cases around Broad Street and Soho and argued that contaminated water from a particular pump was responsible for the spread of disease. His investigation helped change understanding of how cholera moved, although acceptance of his conclusions was gradual. The idea that something invisible in water could cause illness was difficult for many people to accept. Victorian society was comfortable blaming bad smells. It was much less comfortable blaming something too small to see. Flooding made this confusion worse because it created visible evidence of filth everywhere. People saw dirty streets, overflowing drains, and polluted rivers. They naturally connected disease with the obvious mess around them. The missing piece was understanding that the most dangerous part of the flood was not the brown water around your boots. It was the water that looked harmless afterward. A puddle in the street was unpleasant. A contaminated well was deadly. The difference was impossible to judge without scientific knowledge. For families living in crowded neighbourhoods, avoiding contamination was extremely difficult. Clean water sources were limited. Waste disposal was unreliable. Many residents had no choice but to use whatever water was available. Personal hygiene advice could only go so far when the entire environment was working against you. You could wash your hands perfectly and still drink from a contaminated pump. You could clean your home carefully and still live beside an overflowing cesspit. You could do everything right and still be surrounded by a system designed incorrectly. That was the cruel nature of Victorian urban life. Flooding exposed the weakness of the city's infrastructure, but cholera exposed the consequences. Every overflowing drain represented a potential pathway. Every leaking cesspit represented a risk. Every polluted water source represented another opportunity for disease to spread. The city had accidentally created a chain reaction. Rain caused flooding. Flooding spread waste. Waste contaminated water. Contaminated water spread disease. The entire process could begin with something as ordinary as a storm cloud. Eventually, improvements in sanitation, sewer construction, and understanding of disease transmission began changing this deadly cycle. The work of engineers and scientists gradually transformed urban life. Clean water supplies and proper sewage systems became essential parts of modern cities. But the lessons came at a terrible cost. Thousands of people died before the connection between water and disease became widely accepted. Entire communities suffered because the city had grown faster than its ability to protect the people living inside it. As the rain falls over Victorian London, you might imagine the water simply washing the streets clean. But the truth was far more complicated. Rain did not remove the city's problems, it carried them. It lifted waste from hidden places, moved it through neighbourhoods, and delivered invisible danger exactly where people expected safety. The Victorians feared floods because they destroyed homes, damaged businesses, and disrupted daily life. But the most frightening floods were the ones that disappeared. Because once the water was gone, you could no longer see what it had left behind, and that was the cruel trick of cholera. The flood could retreat quietly. The danger stayed behind, waiting patiently in a glass of drinking water. In 1854, while most of London's medical establishment was still blaming bad air for cholera, a quiet physician named John Snow did something radical. He looked at the evidence. Snow mapped cholera deaths in the Soho neighbourhood and traced the outbreak to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His discovery, that cholera was spread through polluted water, not through smells, was one of the most important breakthroughs in medical history. It was also almost completely ignored. As you walk through the streets of Soho during the outbreak, you find a neighbourhood caught between fear and confusion. The usual sounds of London continue around you. Carriages roll over cobblestones. Shopkeepers open their doors. Workers hurry through narrow streets. The city keeps moving because cities have a strange habit of continuing even when everything is going wrong. But behind those ordinary routines, something terrifying is happening. People are becoming sick, fast. The outbreak appears suddenly and spreads with frightening speed. Families wake up to illness. Neighbours disappear behind closed doors. Entire households are affected within days. The fear is not just of the disease itself, but of not understanding it. And when humans do not understand something, they often become extremely creative at being wrong. Victorian London had already decided that bad smells were the enemy. The theory of miasma, or poisonous air, had been accepted by many doctors and officials for years. It seemed logical. The city smelled terrible. Disease was everywhere. Therefore, the terrible smell must be causing the disease. The reasoning was understandable. It was also incorrect. You could stand beside a foul drain, breathe in the horrible air, and feel absolutely certain you had discovered the source of the problem. The smell was obvious. It attacked your senses. It demanded attention. The actual cause was much less dramatic. Tiny organisms hidden in contaminated water. No smell, no warning, no grand entrance. Just something invisible quietly causing disaster. This is what made Jon Snow's approach so unusual. Instead of relying on what seemed obvious, he focused on what could be measured. He studied where people became sick. He collected information. He looked for patterns. At a time when many people were debating the quality of the air, Snow was studying geography, which, as it turns out, was a much better way to find something hiding in water. The Soho outbreak centred around Broad Street, where many residents collected drinking water from a public pump. Snow began recording cases and noticed something important. The deaths were concentrated around the pump. Not randomly, not everywhere. Around that specific source. You can imagine the process of his investigation. Instead of walking through London dramatically declaring that the air smelled suspicious, he worked through details. He visited homes. He spoke with residents. He compared locations. He followed the evidence step by step. It was not flashy. It was not the kind of discovery that arrives with fireworks. It was careful observation, the least dramatic method possible, which is usually how science ruins everyone's favourite assumptions. Snow discovered that many people who had become sick had used water from the Broad Street pump. Meanwhile, some people living nearby had avoided the outbreak because they drank water from other sources. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Well, too consistent for him. Many others still ignored it. The problem was that the idea of water-carrying disease challenged everything many doctors believed. Germ theory was not yet widely accepted. The concept that invisible organisms could exist and cause illness was still developing. Blaming bad air felt much more comfortable. Air was familiar. You could smell it. You could point at it. You could complain about it. A microscopic organism hiding in water was a much more inconvenient enemy, because you could not simply open a window and ask it to leave. Victorian society loved visible explanations. Dirty streets, crowded housing, and unpleasant odours all seemed connected to disease. The environment looked unhealthy, so people assumed the visible dirt itself was responsible. Snow suggested something more complicated. The city was not only dirty above ground, it was contaminated below. The water people trusted was carrying the problem directly into their homes. Imagine explaining this to a Victorian resident. You tell them the water they collect every day, the same water that looks clear and normal, may contain the thing making their neighbours sick. You explain that the smell of the street is not the main danger. The danger is something they cannot see. It sounds almost like a horror story. Except the villain is a cup of water. Snow eventually convinced local officials to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, preventing people from accessing the contaminated source. After that, the outbreak declined. The decision became one of the most famous examples in public health history, but acceptance was slow. Many people still believed miasma was responsible for cholera. Some officials dismissed Snow's findings. His work was important, but recognition did not arrive immediately. History is full of moments where someone discovers the right answer, and everyone else responds with the intellectual equivalent of politely staring at the ceiling. Snow had identified the problem. The city still had to catch up. The Broad Street outbreak revealed something much larger about Victorian cities. The issue was not simply one dirty pump. It was an entire system that allowed contamination to spread. Water supplies were vulnerable, sewers were inadequate, waste management was unreliable. A single mistake in one part of the city could affect hundreds of people because everything was connected. The pump was only the final step in a much longer chain. Waste entered the environment. Rain moved contamination. Groundwater carried it. People drank it. The city had created a perfect transportation network for disease. Unfortunately, unlike the railway system, nobody had intended to build it. Jon Snow's work helped change how people thought about cities themselves. A city was not just streets, buildings, and people. It was also an invisible network of water, waste, and infrastructure beneath everything. What happened underground mattered just as much as what happened above. This was a major shift in thinking. Before, many people viewed sanitation problems as unpleasant, but separate from serious health issues. Snow demonstrated that the connection was direct. The hidden systems of a city could determine whether thousands of people lived or died. The lesson was uncomfortable. Progress required more than impressive buildings and busy factories. It required understanding what happened after the waste left your home. Because flushing something away does not make it disappear. It simply creates a mystery about where it went. And Victorian London had spent decades solving that mystery by sending everything into rivers, drains, and the ground beneath people's feet. As you leave Soho and look back at the crowded streets, you can see the contradiction clearly. This was a city of incredible innovation. It built railways, expanded industry, and shaped global trade. Yet it struggled with something as basic as clean water. The same society that could engineer massive bridges and powerful machines was still learning that drinking from a contaminated pump was probably not ideal. A revolutionary discovery had come from a simple idea. Look at the evidence, follow the pattern, question the obvious answer. Jon Snow did not defeat cholera with a grand invention or a dramatic machine. He defeated it by noticing what everyone else had overlooked. The enemy was not floating through the air, it was flowing through the water, and in a city where the river, the drains, and the drinking supply were all dangerously connected, that discovery changed everything. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is not build something new. Sometimes it is simply realizing that the thing you've been drinking from all along was never supposed to be trusted in the first place. Before the great sewer systems were built, someone had to deal with the waste. That someone was the night soil man. He arrived after dark, climbed down into your cesspit with a bucket and a shovel, and removed what polite society preferred not to think about. The job was as grim as it sounds. Night soil men worked in near total darkness, knee-deep in human waste, breathing in fumes that could and occasionally did kill them on the spot. As the city settles into darkness, when respectable households close their curtains and families prepare for sleep, another part of Victorian London begins its work. While others enjoy the illusion that waste has simply vanished, the night soil men step into the shadows to perform the task that keeps the entire city functioning. You do not see them during the day. That is partly the point. Their work is unpleasant enough that society preferred to keep it hidden. The city depended on them completely, yet many people would rather pretend they did not exist. It was a strange arrangement. Millions of residents produced waste every single day, then collectively decided that the person removing it should remain as invisible as possible. Human nature has always had a fascinating relationship with unpleasant jobs. Everyone agrees the job's important. Everyone agrees someone must do it. Nobody wants to discuss the details. The night soil man lived directly inside that contradiction. The term itself referred to human waste collected from cesspits, privies, and other sanitation systems before modern sewers became widespread. These pits filled gradually, sometimes faster than expected, especially in crowded urban neighbourhoods where dozens of people might share a single waste system. Eventually, someone had to empty them, and that someone arrived with a cart, tools, and a level of courage that deserves considerably more recognition than it usually receives. The work typically happened at night because of both practicality and social discomfort. Darkness offered some privacy from residents who preferred not to watch their waste being removed. It also reduced disruption in busy streets. During the day, London was crowded with workers, merchants, and traffic. At night, the waste collectors could move through neighbourhoods with fewer obstacles, although fewer obstacles did not necessarily mean a better working environment. You approach a cesspit behind a Victorian house and immediately understand why this profession was so feared. The air is thick, The smell is overwhelming. The ground around the pit is damp and unstable. A worker lowers himself down into a place that most people would not willingly stand near, even for a few seconds. Then he begins. The process was slow and physically demanding. Waste had to be removed manually using buckets and shovels, then loaded onto carts for transport. Every movement required effort. Every mistake created a problem. There were no machines quietly handling the unpleasant parts. No automatic systems. No convenient button labelled "remove everything unpleasant from existence." Just a person with a shovel having a very unfortunate evening. The job carried serious risks. Cesspits could contain dangerous gases produced by decomposition. Poor ventilation made these spaces hazardous. Workers sometimes became overwhelmed by fumes, lost consciousness, and fell into the pits they were trying to empty. Others suffered from illness caused by constant exposure to contaminated material. It was not exactly the kind of workplace where a modern safety inspector would arrive and say, "Excellent, this seems properly managed." Protective equipment was limited. Understanding of workplace hazards was incomplete. The workers themselves often had little choice. Many were among the poorest members of society, taking difficult jobs because difficult jobs were the ones available. The irony was that these workers were essential to public health. Without them, cities would have become even more unbearable. Every emptied cesspit reduced the risk of overflow. Every removed load prevented waste from accumulating further beneath homes. Their work directly helped neighbourhoods survive despite inadequate sanitation systems. Yet the people performing this essential service often received little respect. They handled the waste everyone else wanted to forget. They carried away the evidence of daily life. They were the final link in a sanitation chain that society desperately needed but preferred not to acknowledge. You might think a job this unpleasant would at least come with excellent pay. Unfortunately, history rarely works that generously. Night soil men generally earned modest wages despite the difficulty and danger of their work. They carried heavy loads, worked in terrible conditions, and faced social stigma because of their occupation. Their contribution was enormous, but their reward was mostly the privilege of being allowed to continue doing it. Victorian society had many contradictions. It celebrated invention, industry, and progress. But some of the people making that progress possible were those cleaning up the consequences afterward. The night soil men were part of a hidden workforce that kept cities alive. Alongside them were street cleaners, scavengers, sewer workers, and others whose jobs existed because growing cities produced endless amounts of waste. The Industrial Revolution created incredible wealth. It also created incredible amounts of rubbish. Someone had to deal with both. The work of night soil men also reveals just how fragile Victorian sanitation really was. The system depended on thousands of individual actions. Households filled cesspits. Workers emptied them. Cart drivers transported waste away. Disposal sites received it. If any part of this process failed, problems quickly returned. A delayed collection could mean overflowing pits. An overflowing pit could mean contaminated streets. Contaminated streets could mean disease. The entire city depended on a group of workers who operated mostly at night, carrying away the consequences of everyone else's existence. It was not glamorous, it was not celebrated, but it was absolutely necessary. Eventually, improvements in sewer systems reduced the need for night soil collection in major cities. Large-scale underground networks allowed waste to be transported more efficiently. Engineers created systems that moved sewage away from homes and reduced dependence on manual removal. For the first time, cities began separating daily life from the waste it produced. A revolutionary idea, almost suspiciously obvious in hindsight. But before those improvements arrived, the night soil men carried the burden of a city's sanitation problem on their shoulders. As you walk through Victorian London after midnight, you might notice the contrast. Above ground, the city appears peaceful. Gas lamps glow softly. Houses stand quietly along narrow streets. Families sleep behind closed doors. But below those streets, and behind those homes, another world exists. A world of overflowing pits, hidden drains, and workers handling the things everyone else prefers not to mention. The city sleeps because someone else stays awake, and perhaps that is the strangest part. The Victorians built a society fascinated by cleanliness, manners, and respectability. They valued appearances, they carefully controlled conversations, They dressed formally and maintained strict social rules. Then, after everyone went to bed, someone arrived with a shovel to deal with the reality underneath it all. The night soil man was the person who reminded Victorian society that no matter how elegant the house, how polished the furniture, or how expensive the clothing, everyone eventually contributed to the same underground problem. Because civilization may be built on great ideas, impressive buildings, and technological achievements, but occasionally it is also built on a person standing in the dark with a bucket doing the job nobody wants to admit exists. When a major flood hit a Victorian city, it didn't look like the dramatic stock footage you see on modern news broadcasts. It looked worse. Water rose slowly, steadily, mixing with the contents of every cesspit, gutter, and open drain in its path. By the time it reached knee height in a working-class neighbourhood, the flood was less water and more soup. A thick, dark, foul-smelling slurry of sewage, dead rats, industrial chemicals, rotting food, and whatever else had been sitting in the streets waiting for an excuse to float. As you step outside during one of these floods, the first thing you notice is that the city has changed shape. Streets that once guided people to markets, factories, and homes have become unfamiliar channels of moving water. The usual landmarks remain, but they now appear strangely disconnected. Doorways sit behind small waves, alleyways become streams, courtyards turn into shallow ponds where nobody has planned any swimming activities. The Victorian city has not disappeared. It has simply become a much worse version of itself. There is no sudden cinematic wall of water rushing dramatically through the streets. Most urban floods developed slowly as rain overwhelmed drains. Rivers rose beyond their banks, and underground systems began surrendering one failure at a time. The danger came from the fact that the city often gave plenty of warning, but very few practical solutions. You could see the problem arriving. You just could not stop it. At first, residents noticed small inconveniences: a puddle outside the front door, a gutter overflowing onto the pavement, water collecting in the street longer than usual. Neighbours exchanged concerned looks while convincing themselves that perhaps the rain would stop soon. Victorian optimism was surprisingly durable. Even when standing beside a rapidly expanding puddle containing suspicious material, people often hoped the situation would resolve itself. Humanity has always possessed an impressive ability to underestimate water. It seems harmless because one drop is harmless. Unfortunately, cities are built from millions of drops arriving together with very poor intentions. As the rain continued, the streets became increasingly difficult to navigate. Horse carts slowed. Wheels sank into muddy surfaces. Pedestrians lifted their skirts and trousers to avoid the deepest water, though eventually there was nowhere left to avoid. Boots became soaked. Clothing became stained. Every journey became a careful negotiation between reaching your destination and discovering what unpleasant object was hiding beneath the surface. The floodwater itself carried the history of the neighbourhood. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. Modern floodwater is already considered dangerous, but Victorian floodwater had an unusually detailed understanding of local life. It collected everything the city had discarded: waste from homes, refuse from markets, runoff from factories, material from stables, the contents of drains that were never designed to handle extreme weather. Every street contributed something. Every building had something to add. The flood became a disgusting summary of everything the city had produced. You might watch objects drift past your doorway and realize that the flood was not just water moving through the neighborhood. It was the entire neighborhood moving through the water. Wooden crates floated beside scraps of cloth. Food waste spun slowly in the current. Household items escaped from homes. Broken furniture travelled down streets where people had once walked to work. The water had become a very unpleasant parade, and unfortunately, nobody had purchased tickets. For families living on lower floors, the flood was especially destructive. Many working-class homes were small and crowded, with possessions stored wherever space allowed. When water entered, there was little room to move things higher. A few inches of flooding could damage bedding, clothing, food supplies, and anything made from wood. A poor family did not have a storage room full of replacements. They had what was inside the room, and once the flood reached it, that was often all they lost. You might try lifting furniture onto chairs or placing belongings on shelves, but there was only so much preparation possible. Victorian homes were not designed with flood barriers, waterproof materials, or emergency storage in mind. The expectation was not that water would enter your living space. The problem was that water did not respect expectations. Basements flooded first, then ground floors. Eventually, entire streets could become surrounded by water. Residents used whatever they had available. Wooden boards became makeshift bridges. Barrels became floating platforms. Carriages transported people through deeper sections. Boats were occasionally used where streets had become impossible to cross. A city famous for horse-drawn transport suddenly discovered that boats had become useful on roads. Somewhere, a Victorian engineer was probably very proud. Somewhere else, a homeowner was probably wondering why his front doorstep had become a dock. Businesses suffered as well. Shops could not operate normally when customers had to wade through contaminated water to reach the entrance. Goods were damaged, deliveries stopped, markets struggled as food supplies were spoiled or delayed. A flooded street was not just an inconvenience, it was an economic event. The working classes felt this most severely because many depended on daily wages. If factories closed or transport failed, income disappeared quickly. A flood could remove both possessions and the ability to replace them. The water did not simply damage your home, it damaged your entire ability to recover. The psychological effect was also significant. Flooding created uncertainty. Residents never knew exactly how high the water would rise, how long it would remain, or what damage they would discover afterward. Every storm carried a question. Will this be normal rain? Or will the basement become a swimming pool again? The answer depended on countless factors outside individual control. The neighbourhood, the drainage system, the river level, the intensity of the storm, the general willingness of Victorian infrastructure to continue functioning. Unfortunately, Victorian infrastructure had a habit of choosing inconvenient moments to stop cooperating. Once the rain finally ended, the flood did not simply vanish. The water slowly drained away, leaving behind thick mud, damaged buildings, and a smell that seemed determined to remain part of the neighbourhood. Cleaning began immediately. Streets needed clearing, homes needed drying, furniture needed repairing or replacing, waste needed removing. And then came the difficult question. Where did everything go? The same problem that created the flood remained afterward. The city still needed somewhere to put all the material that the water had moved around. The flood had only rearranged the mess, it had not solved it. In the days afterward, residents opened windows to remove the smell. Walls were scrubbed, floors were cleaned, clothing was washed repeatedly. Yet some reminders remained. Damp patches on walls, damaged wood, lingering odours. The flood left a mark long after the water disappeared. This was what made Victorian floods so devastating. They were not simply moments when streets became wet. They were events that exposed every weakness in the urban environment. Poor drainage, overcrowding, weak sanitation, inadequate housing, a lack of preparation. The flood simply revealed what had already been there. As you walk through the city after the water recedes, you see people returning to their routines. Shops reopen, workers return, children find dry patches of street to play on. Life continues because it always does, but everyone remembers. They remember how quickly familiar streets changed. They remember what floated past their homes. They remember the smell, and they remember the uncomfortable truth that Victorian cities were not defeated by some extraordinary disaster from outside. They were defeated by their own design. The flood did not invade the city. The city had spent decades preparing a welcome invitation. It paved over natural drainage, buried streams, overwhelmed sewers, and built homes in vulnerable places. Then, when the rain arrived, the water simply accepted the invitation, and judging by what it brought with it, it was clearly determined to be a very thorough guest. On the night of February the 5th, 1852, the embankment of the Bilberry Reservoir above the town of Holmfirth in West Yorkshire simply gave way. 86 million gallons of water tore down the home valley in the dead of night, ripping through mills, cottages and bridges like they were made of cardboard. 81 people died, many of them children, dragged from their beds before they even knew what was happening. As you imagine yourself in Holmfirth that night, the first thing you notice is how ordinary everything seems. The town is quiet. Families are asleep. Workers who spent the day in mills and workshops have finally returned home. Fires burn low. Candles have been extinguished. Outside, the valley rests beneath the darkness of a winter night. There is no warning, no dramatic announcement, no modern emergency alert lighting up every household with a message telling you to evacuate immediately. The people of Holmfirth simply go to sleep above a disaster they cannot see. High above the town sits Bilberry Reservoir, a large artificial lake created to supply water for local industry. Like many Victorian engineering projects, it represented confidence, ambition, and the belief that humans could reshape the landscape to serve progress. Reservoirs provided essential water supplies for growing industrial communities. They supported factories, powered machinery, and helped fuel the expansion of towns across Britain. But they also contained an enormous amount of stored energy. Water does not look dangerous when it is sitting peacefully behind a wall. It looks calm, almost harmless, which is perhaps why people are so often surprised when it remembers that it weighs thousands of tons. The Bilberry Reservoir had been constructed to support the local textile industry, especially the many mills that depended on reliable water supplies. The home valley was an industrial centre, filled with factories, workers and homes built close together. The same geography that made the area ideal for industry also created a serious vulnerability. The town sat below the reservoir. The water sat above the town. This arrangement worked perfectly. Right up until the moment it did not. In the weeks before the disaster, heavy rainfall had affected the area. The ground became saturated, the reservoir filled, pressure increased against the embankment, holding back millions of gallons of water. The structure was not prepared for what came next. Shortly after midnight, the earth and materials supporting the reservoir began to fail. At first, it would have been almost impossible for anyone below to understand what was happening. A distant sound, a strange movement, perhaps nothing noticeable at all. Then the reservoir broke, and the water began moving downhill. Fast. The flood that followed was not like the gradual street flooding experienced in many Victorian cities. This was a sudden release of enormous force. A wall of water rushed through the valley, carrying debris, trees, stones, and pieces of buildings with it. You're no longer dealing with a flooded street. You're dealing with a river that has decided to arrive all at once. The first victims had almost no chance to react. Many were asleep inside their homes. The water reached them before they understood there was danger. In the darkness, families woke to confusion, noise, and destruction. Imagine being pulled from sleep by a sound you cannot identify. The walls shake. The floor becomes wet. People shout. The darkness outside hides the scale of what is approaching, and then the water arrives. Victorian homes were not built to withstand this kind of force. Wooden structures, stone cottages, and mill buildings could survive ordinary weather, but not millions of gallons of water moving with tremendous speed and carrying the remains of everything in its path. Bridges collapsed, walls disappeared, factories were damaged or destroyed. The valley floor became a path of destruction. The industrial nature of Holmfirth made the disaster even more devastating. Mills were located close to waterways because factories needed access to power and transportation. Workers lived nearby because walking distance mattered in an era before modern commuting. The same layout that made industrial life possible also placed thousands of people directly beside the consequences of industrial infrastructure. The flood did not care whether a building was a home or a factory. It simply moved through. By morning, the scale of the disaster became clear. Survivors emerged into a landscape that looked completely transformed. Buildings were damaged. Streets were covered in debris. Families searched for missing relatives. The valley that had been familiar only hours earlier had become almost unrecognizable. The emotional shock was enormous. Disasters are difficult enough when they arrive during the day, when people can see what is happening and attempt to respond. A nighttime disaster removes that advantage. Darkness turns confusion into terror. You cannot prepare for what you cannot see. You cannot outrun what you do not know is coming. The Holmfirth disaster became one of Britain's worst reservoir failures of the 19th century. It also raised serious questions about Victorian engineering standards and regulation. How could a structure holding back so much water fail above a populated town? The answer involved a combination of factors, including design problems, construction issues, and insufficient oversight. At the time, large engineering projects were often developed during a period of rapid industrial expansion, where ambition sometimes moved faster than regulation. Victorian Britain was famous for building enormous things: railways, bridges, factories, reservoirs. The challenge was ensuring that every ambitious project was as reliable as it was impressive. The disaster forced people to reconsider how reservoirs were designed and monitored. Public concern grew over the safety of large water storage projects. Engineers studied the failure and looked for ways to prevent similar tragedies. This was one of the recurring patterns of the Victorian era. A terrible disaster would expose a weakness in the system. Engineers would develop solutions, and society would slowly become safer because people had learned what happened when they were not careful enough. A rather expensive method of improvement, but unfortunately one humanity has used repeatedly. For the people of Holmfirth, however, engineering lessons came too late. The disaster was not an abstract case study. It was a personal tragedy that affected families, neighbourhoods, and an entire community. The victims were ordinary people, workers, parents, children, neighbours, people who had gone to sleep expecting another ordinary morning. Instead, they became part of a story remembered across generations. As you look over the valley afterward, the most striking thing is the silence. The rushing water is gone. The storm has passed. The destruction remains. The flood has done what floods always do. It has revealed weakness. The Holmfirth disaster was different from the slow flooding of Victorian streets, where water gradually crept into homes and carried away the city's waste. This was a disaster of speed and force. The danger was not contaminated water slowly spreading through neighbourhoods. It was an entire reservoir suddenly deciding it had other plans. And that is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. Victorian cities often struggled with floods because they underestimated water. They treated it as something manageable, something that could be directed, stored, and controlled. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they built a wall, filled a reservoir, and created something useful. And sometimes, in the quiet darkness of a February night, the water reminded everyone that it had never truly been under control. It had only been waiting. Just after 11:30 on the night of March the 11th, 1864, the Dale Dyke Dam above Sheffield collapsed. The dam had been filling for the first time. A workman had noticed a crack in the embankment earlier that afternoon. The chief engineer inspected it, declared it would hold, and went home. He was wrong. 700 million gallons of water roared down the Loxley Valley, destroying everything in its path. As you imagine yourself in Sheffield that night, the first thing you notice is how peaceful everything appears before disaster arrives. The factories have gone quiet. Workers have returned home after another long day. Families are asleep. The valley is dark except for the occasional glow of candles and fires inside houses. High above them, however, sits a reservoir holding back an unimaginable amount of water. 700 million gallons. A number so large that it becomes difficult to picture. It is the kind of measurement that sounds less like a real amount of water and more like a Victorian engineer accidentally creating an ocean in the wrong place. The Dale Dyke Reservoir was part of the growing Victorian effort to provide reliable water supplies for expanding industrial cities. Sheffield was a major centre of manufacturing, especially known for steel production. Its factories required enormous amounts of water, and the new reservoir represented progress, confidence, and the belief that engineering could solve almost any problem. The Victorians were very good at building impressive things. They were sometimes less impressive at admitting when those things needed another inspection. The dam was still being completed when it began filling for the first time. This was supposed to be a moment of achievement, a symbol of modern engineering, a triumph over nature. Instead, nature looked at the dam and politely waited for its opportunity to disagree. Earlier on the day of the disaster, a workman noticed a crack forming in the embankment. This was not exactly the sort of detail you hope to discover when you are responsible for holding back hundreds of millions of gallons of water. A crack in a dam is generally considered an invitation for concern, rather than a charming architectural feature. The issue was reported. The structure was inspected. The decision was made that the dam would hold. and for several hours everyone continued believing that. You can almost feel the dangerous confidence of the moment. The reservoir stood quietly. The water remained behind the embankment. The town below continued its evening routine. Nothing appeared wrong, which, historically speaking, is often when things become very wrong. Shortly after 11:30 the situation changed. The embankment failed. The water that had been patiently contained for weeks suddenly had nothing preventing it from moving downhill. Gravity, which had been waiting silently in the background the entire time, immediately resumed its responsibilities. The result was catastrophic. The flood did not gradually rise through streets like ordinary urban flooding. There was no time for residents to notice rising puddles or move belongings upstairs. The water arrived as a violent wall. It tore through the Loxley Valley with enormous force, carrying soil, trees, debris and pieces of buildings along with it. Homes that had stood for years were overwhelmed in moments. Bridges disappeared, roads vanished. Entire sections of the landscape were transformed almost instantly. The people below had almost no warning. Many were asleep. Some heard the sound before they understood what it meant. A distant rumbling, a strange vibration, a noise unlike anything an ordinary night should contain. Then came the water. Imagine waking in darkness to find your home filling rapidly. There is no modern emergency message, no siren system reaching every household, no phone warning you that several 100 million gallons of water are heading your way. There is only confusion, and then the realization that the impossible thing happening outside is very real. The flood struck settlements throughout the valley, affecting workers, families and communities built around the industries that made Sheffield prosperous. The same waterways that powered factories and supported development had become the path of destruction. The valley had been shaped by water. Now water reshaped it. The destruction was widespread. Houses were swept away. Industrial buildings were damaged. Roads and bridges were destroyed. The floodwaters continued for miles, leaving devastation behind as they moved toward Sheffield and surrounding areas. When morning came, survivors faced a scene that was difficult to comprehend. The darkness had hidden the scale of the disaster. Daylight revealed everything. Debris covered the landscape. Buildings were damaged or gone entirely. Families searched for missing relatives. Communities that had existed peacefully the day before were suddenly dealing with loss and destruction. The final death toll reached more than 200 people, making it one of the deadliest floods in British history. Among the victims were many ordinary residents who had no connection to the dam itself. They were simply people living in the valley below, unaware that a failure miles away would decide their fate. That was what made the disaster so terrifying. The danger was not visible. The dam was not collapsing in front of them. The threat was sitting quietly above them, hidden in the darkness. The tragedy also raised serious questions about Victorian engineering practices. How could a newly constructed dam fail during its first filling? Why were concerns about the crack not treated with greater urgency? Could better inspection and oversight have prevented the disaster? These questions became central to the investigation that followed. The failure revealed the dangers of rapid industrial expansion without enough regulation. Victorian Britain was transforming at incredible speed. Cities grew, factories expanded, infrastructure projects multiplied. But every ambitious project carried risks. A railway accident could kill passengers, a factory failure could injure workers, a dam failure could erase entire communities. The Sheffield flood became a powerful reminder that engineering confidence needed to be matched by engineering caution. A bridge could be beautiful, a reservoir could be impressive, a machine could be revolutionary. But if the foundations were weak, all the progress in the world could collapse in a single night. The disaster also changed how future dams were designed and inspected. Engineers studied the failure, improved methods, and developed stronger approaches to construction and monitoring. In a painful way, the tragedy helped make future infrastructure safer. That was one of the recurring patterns of the Victorian age. The era produced extraordinary achievements. It also produced extraordinary reminders that every achievement came with responsibility. As you walk through the valley after the flood, you can imagine the strange contrast. The factories will eventually rebuild. The roads will eventually be repaired. Life will slowly return, but the memory remains. A quiet evening. A crack in an embankment. a decision that everything would probably be fine. And then 700 million gallons of water, proving that probably is not a particularly strong engineering measurement. The Sheffield flood was not caused by a storm alone. It was not caused by nature suddenly becoming unpredictable. The water behaved exactly as water always does. It followed gravity. It moved toward lower ground. It took the easiest path available. The tragedy came because humans placed a massive amount of water above a populated valley and trusted that the structure holding it back would do its job. Most of the time, it did. This time, it did not, and that is perhaps the most unsettling thing about Victorian disasters. They were often not caused by a lack of ambition. They were caused by ambition moving faster than caution. The Victorians built enormous things because they believed the future belonged to those brave enough to create it. They were right. But occasionally the future arrived carrying 700 million gallons of water and absolutely no intention of slowing down. Victorian engineers were brilliant, ambitious, and occasionally catastrophically overconfident. They built dams out of earth and puddle clay, a mixture of clay and gravel packed into the centre of an embankment to make it waterproof. On paper, it worked beautifully. In practice, puddle clay was temperamental. It cracked when it dried. It softened when it got too wet. It shifted under the enormous pressure of millions of gallons of water pressing against it day after day. As you stand beside a Victorian reservoir, you might initially be impressed. The scale alone is remarkable. Hillsides reshaped, valleys transformed, thousands of tons of earth moved by hand and machine to create a structure capable of holding back an artificial lake. It represents confidence. It represents progress. It represents the belief that humans can look at a landscape and confidently announce, "This would be better if we put a giant wall here." And sometimes they were absolutely right. Victorian engineers achieved incredible things. They built railways across difficult terrain, constructed enormous bridges, designed complex machinery, and transformed cities at a pace the world had never experienced before. But the same confidence that allowed them to create extraordinary projects could occasionally become dangerous, especially when the project involved holding back enough water to erase a town. Reservoir construction became increasingly important during the 19th century because industrial cities needed reliable water supplies. Growing populations, expanding factories, and new industries placed enormous demands on local water sources. Rivers alone were not always enough, so engineers looked for ways to store water. The solution was reservoirs. A reservoir was essentially a promise between humans and nature. The humans would build a barrier. Nature would provide the water. Everyone would cooperate. The problem was that nature has never been particularly interested in signing agreements. The dams built during this period were often earth embankments, rather than the massive concrete structures many people imagine today. Instead of a solid wall of stone or concrete, they relied on carefully constructed layers of soil, rock, and clay. The idea was logical: build up a strong barrier, use clay to prevent leaks, compress the materials tightly, allow the structure to hold the water behind it. The puddle clay core was one of the most important parts of these designs. It acted as a waterproof barrier inside the embankment, stopping water from slowly passing through the dam. When properly prepared and maintained, it could work effectively. The problem was that puddle clay was not a magical substance. It was still clay. And clay has opinions. It reacts to changes in moisture. It expands and contracts. It can weaken if conditions change. It requires careful handling during construction. A tiny problem deep inside the structure might remain invisible until enormous pressure exposed it, which is unfortunate because dams are not exactly the type of structures where you want surprises. A leaking garden hose is inconvenient. A leaking reservoir is a very different conversation. Victorian engineers understood many of these challenges, but the science of soil behaviour was still developing. Modern geotechnical engineering, with detailed soil testing and advanced monitoring techniques, did not exist in the same form. Engineers relied heavily on experience, observation, calculations, and practical knowledge. They were skilled. They were innovative, but they were working with incomplete information. Imagine building a massive structure while only partly understanding the material holding it together. That was the reality facing many 19th century engineers. It was not foolish. It was simply the limits of the time. Unfortunately, the consequences of those limits could be enormous. Reservoirs created a unique problem because failure did not happen gradually from the perspective of those living below. The structure might appear completely normal for years. The water would sit quietly, the landscape would look peaceful, then something would change. A crack, a leak, a weak section, a shift in the embankment. Suddenly a structure designed to control water would become the path for uncontrolled water. You can imagine the strange confidence of looking at a finished reservoir. The wall stands, the water remains contained, the project has succeeded. The temptation is to believe the danger is gone, but with large engineering projects, the most important parts are often the ones you cannot see. The centre of the dam, the foundation beneath it, the materials hidden inside layers of earth, the places where tiny problems can grow quietly. Victorian newspapers often celebrated engineering achievements. Reservoirs were symbols of modern civilization. They showed that humans could organize landscapes, provide resources, and support growing cities. And that was true. But every engineering achievement carried responsibility. A reservoir was not simply a lake, it was a lake held above people. That distinction mattered. The communities below depended on the engineers above. If the design succeeded, everyone benefited. If it failed, the consequences travelled downhill, literally. The disasters at places like Holmfirth and Sheffield showed the danger of assuming that impressive construction automatically meant safe construction. They revealed that confidence needed to be supported by constant inspection, maintenance, and honest evaluation of risks. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the Victorian era. A disaster would happen. People would ask how it was possible. Engineers would study the failure. New rules would appear. The world would become slightly safer. It was a slow and expensive way to improve, but it was improvement nonetheless. The development of modern engineering owes much to these lessons. Every failed structure, every investigation, and every redesign contributed to better understanding. The Victorian engineers were not careless fools. They were pioneers working at the edge of what was possible. They built things that previous generations could barely imagine. They simply lived in a time when imagination sometimes moved faster than caution. As you look across a Victorian reservoir today, it is easy to forget the uncertainty involved in creating it. The calm water surface hides the complexity beneath. The quiet landscape hides the calculations, labour, and risks that created it. A reservoir looks peaceful. That is the trick. Millions of gallons of water sitting calmly behind a wall creates the illusion of complete control. But the water is always there. The pressure never stops. The structure is always working. Every second of every day, the dam is quietly negotiating with physics, and physics is not known for being particularly flexible. The Victorians learned that building something enormous requires more than ambition. It requires patience, testing, maintenance, the willingness to admit that even brilliant ideas can fail. Because the greatest danger was never that Victorian engineers lacked confidence. They had plenty. Sometimes they had enough confidence for everyone. The real challenge was making sure that confidence was supported by knowledge. Otherwise, the result was a very Victorian combination of genius and disaster, a magnificent engineering achievement, a revolutionary improvement, and occasionally a very expensive reminder that a puddle of clay, standing between a town and millions of gallons of water, deserves slightly more attention than someone saying it will probably be fine. The great irony of Victorian flooding was that progress often made things worse. The flush toilet, hailed as a triumph of modern hygiene, overwhelmed the old sewer systems and pushed even more waste into the rivers. New factories pumped chemical runoff into waterways already struggling to cope. Railways cut through natural drainage patterns, and the rapid expansion of cities paved over the fields and meadows that had once absorbed rainfall, replacing them with cobblestones and brick that sent every drop straight into the streets. As you walk through a Victorian city during this period of transformation, you can almost feel the contradiction surrounding you. Everywhere you look, there are signs of progress. Steam engines roar. Factories operate day and night. Railways connect places that once took days to reach. New buildings rise higher than previous generations ever imagined. The city looks like the future. Unfortunately, the future has a drainage problem. Victorian Britain was experiencing one of the fastest periods of urban change in history. Millions of people moved into cities seeking work in factories and industries. Towns expanded rapidly. Streets filled with workers, merchants, machines, and businesses. The old systems were simply not prepared. A village drain cannot suddenly become responsible for a massive industrial city just because everyone decided to build factories nearby. But that was exactly what happened. The Victorian era was full of inventions designed to improve daily life. Many of these innovations genuinely did make life better. Clean water systems, improved transportation, better communication, and new technologies transformed society. The problem was not progress itself. The problem was that progress arrived faster than cities could adapt. The flush toilet is perhaps the perfect example. To modern eyes, the flush toilet seems like one of civilization's greatest achievements. You press a button or pull a handle, and the unpleasant problem disappears instantly. A small miracle, a tiny indoor machine that allows you to pretend one of the life's least glamorous activities never happened. Victorians loved the idea too. Indoor plumbing became associated with cleanliness, comfort, and modern living. Wealthier households installed flush toilets as symbols of improvement and status. The issue was what happened afterward. The waste did not vanish, it travelled, and the existing sewer systems were not designed for the enormous increase in volume created by thousands of new toilets connecting to old drainage networks. You had taken a system built for a smaller population and suddenly asked it to handle the consequences of a much larger one. It was like hiring one person to wash dishes for an entire restaurant, and then being surprised when the kitchen becomes slightly overwhelmed. The same pattern appeared across Victorian industries. Factories transformed Britain into an industrial powerhouse, but industrial growth came with environmental costs. Manufacturing processes produced waste materials that often ended up in rivers and streams. Waterways became convenient disposal routes. If a river was already carrying waste away, it seemed logical to use it for more waste. The problem was that everyone had the same idea. The river became the place where society sent everything it did not want to deal with. Human waste, industrial chemicals, animal waste, household rubbish. The river became less like a natural feature and more like a very unpleasant underground trash collection service that happened to be visible. Factories were not usually dumping waste out of pure carelessness. They were operating within the understanding of the time. Environmental science was limited, regulations were minimal, the consequences of pollution were not fully understood. The goal was production. The assumption was that nature would somehow absorb the leftovers. Nature, unfortunately, was not consulted, and nature had limits. The expansion of railways created another unexpected problem. Railways revolutionized transportation. They connected cities, moved goods, and helped industries grow. But building them required reshaping landscapes. Railway embankments, tracks, and bridges altered the way water naturally moved through the environment. Streams were redirected. Ground was covered. Existing drainage routes were changed. Every railway line represented human engineering triumph. It also represented another small argument with gravity. Water that once flowed naturally across fields now encountered barriers. Rain that once soaked into open land now collected against roads, buildings, and tracks. The city was slowly becoming a giant hard surface, and hard surfaces have one annoying habit. They do not absorb water. Before urban expansion, fields, forests, and grasslands acted like natural sponges. Rain fell, soaked into soil, and slowly moved through the landscape. Then cities replaced those spaces with stone, brick, and pavement. The rain fell. The ground said no. The water looked for somewhere else to go. Usually that somewhere else was the street. This was one of the major reasons Victorian floods became so severe. Cities were not only receiving more water from storms, they were also removing the natural systems that previously managed that water. The landscape had been redesigned for human convenience. Unfortunately, nobody had redesigned it for heavy rainfall. You can picture a Victorian neighbourhood during a storm. Rain hits rooftops and immediately runs into gutters. Gutters overflow into streets. Streets cannot absorb the water because they are covered in stone and compacted dirt. The entire city becomes a collection of surfaces directing water toward the lowest point. And the lowest point is usually where people live. The poorest residents often suffered the most because their neighbourhoods were frequently built on lower ground, close to rivers or industrial areas, making low-lying neighbourhoods vulnerable to flooding. These communities already faced overcrowding and poor sanitation. Flooding added another layer of misery. A wealthy homeowner might complain about a damp cellar. A poor family might lose everything they owned. Progress was not experienced equally. The Victorian era produced incredible wealth, but it also exposed the dangers of rapid growth without enough planning. Cities expanded because they had to. Populations increased. Industries demanded space. Everyone was focused on building more. Very few people were asking whether the city could handle what had already been built. This created a strange contradiction. Victorian society was obsessed with improvement. Everything needed to be newer, bigger, faster, and more efficient. But sometimes the old systems were still quietly holding everything together. The drainage network, the natural landscape, the rivers, the soil. These were the invisible foundations of urban life. And when they were overwhelmed, the consequences became obvious. The flood was simply the moment when the city received the bill for decades of decisions. You might think progress always means replacing the old with something better. But Victorian flooding showed that removing old systems without understanding their purpose can create new problems. A field was not just empty land. It was a place where rain could disappear. A river was not just a convenient waste channel. It was part of a larger natural system. A sewer was not just a pipe. It was the difference between a functioning city and a very expensive experiment in moving unpleasant things around. The Victorians were not wrong to pursue progress. Without their innovations, modern life would look completely different. But they learned a lesson that every generation eventually discovers. Building something new is easy. Making sure everything still works afterward is much harder. Because sometimes the greatest symbol of progress is also the thing that reveals the problem. A brand new toilet, a powerful factory, a revolutionary railway, all signs of a modern age, all connected to a city that still had no idea what to do when the rain refused to cooperate. And when the skies opened, Victorian cities discovered the uncomfortable truth. You can build the future as quickly as you want, but if the water has nowhere to go, the future may still end up floating in the street. Of all the horrors of Victorian flooding, the deaths of children remain the most haunting. In the Sheffield flood of 1864, many of the 240 victims were children. Families living in the valley floor had no warning. The wall of water struck in the middle of the night, filling houses in seconds. Parents scrambled to reach upper floors clutching infants, calling for older children who had already been swept away. As you imagine yourself in one of those homes on that night, the tragedy becomes painfully clear. There is no dramatic moment where a family sees the danger approaching and makes a careful plan. There is no time to gather belongings, prepare supplies, or escape with everyone safely together. There is only sleep, then confusion, then terror. Victorian families often lived close together in small houses, especially in industrial towns where workers needed to be near factories and mills. Rooms were shared. Several children might sleep together. Parents rested after long working days, unaware that the greatest threat to their family was not inside the home. It was waiting above them, or rather somewhere above them. A reservoir, a river, a rising body of water that most people never thought about during ordinary life. That was what made these disasters so cruel. The victims were not ignoring obvious danger. They were not standing beside a flood and refusing to move. Many were simply sleeping in homes they believed were safe. A house is supposed to protect you. A bedroom is supposed to be the safest place in it. But on those nights, the bedroom became the place where some families had the least chance to escape. In the 19th century, children were already facing a difficult world. Disease was common, accidents were frequent. Working-class children often grew up surrounded by industrial hazards, poor sanitation, and overcrowded living conditions. But flooding created a different kind of danger. It arrived suddenly. It ignored age, and it turned ordinary homes into traps. Imagine waking up and feeling cold water on the floor. At first, you may not understand. Perhaps you think a pipe has burst. Perhaps you think the rain has caused a small leak. Then the water rises higher. The darkness makes everything worse. You cannot immediately see what is happening. Furniture moves, objects float, doors become difficult to open. It was no longer the same room. The floor was moving. The walls were shaking. The people they trusted were suddenly struggling to control a situation that nobody could understand. Parents faced impossible decisions. In moments of disaster, there is no perfect choice. Families tried to lift children, reach higher ground, and escape through windows or upper floors. But floods do not wait for people to organize themselves. They do not pause while a family gathers everyone together. Water moves according to physics, not according to what would be fair, and physics has never been known for its sympathy. In the Sheffield flood, entire communities were affected. The water moved through the valley with tremendous force, destroying homes and carrying away people before they had a chance to react. Many victims were children, because children were among those most vulnerable. They were smaller, less able to escape, and often asleep when the disaster began. The image of children being lost in their beds became one of the most painful memories associated with Victorian flooding. It represented something deeper than the loss of life. It represented the destruction of the one place where people expected safety, the home. Victorian society placed enormous importance on family and domestic life. The home was supposed to be a refuge from the harshness of industrial cities. After long days working in factories, mines, or workshops, families returned home for rest. But flooding revealed that even home was not always secure. The disaster also exposed the inequality of Victorian cities. Poorer families often lived in locations that placed them at greater risk. Industrial towns grew around rivers because water was essential for factories and transportation. Workers needed to live near their jobs. Factories needed to be near water. The result was that many working-class neighbourhoods developed in areas where flooding could cause the greatest damage. The people with the fewest resources were often the people living closest to danger. A wealthy family might have the option to relocate. A working family usually did not. For children, this meant their lives were shaped by decisions made long before they were born. They lived where their parents could afford to live, in communities built around the needs of industry. They were not responsible for the risks around them, but they experienced the consequences. After major floods, communities mourned deeply. Newspapers published accounts of the victims. Families searched for missing relatives. Memorials were created. Survivors carried memories of the disaster for the rest of their lives. The loss of children was especially devastating because it represented lost futures. Every child carried possibilities that would never happen. A future worker, a future parent, a future neighbour, a future person who would have added something to the world. Instead, their stories became part of the disaster itself. These tragedies also changed how people thought about safety and responsibility. A flood was no longer simply an unfortunate natural event. Questions began to emerge about whether disasters caused by infrastructure failures could have been prevented. Could the dam have been safer? Could warnings have been given? Could homes have been protected? Could authorities have acted differently? These questions mattered because the victims were not lost in some unavoidable storm at sea. They were lost because human decisions had created conditions where disaster was possible. That realization was uncomfortable. It meant that progress came with responsibility. Building a reservoir was not just about engineering success. It was about protecting the people living below it. Expanding a city was not just about creating jobs. It was about creating safe places for families. The Victorian era was full of remarkable achievements, but these tragedies showed the human cost when development moved faster than protection. As you picture the quiet homes before the flood, the most heartbreaking detail is how normal everything seemed. Children sleeping, parents resting, families expecting another ordinary morning. Nobody knew that the night would become a memory carried through generations. Nobody knew that a distant failure would reach them before sunrise. And perhaps that is what makes these stories so powerful. Floods are often described through numbers: millions of gallons of water, hundreds of destroyed buildings, dozens or hundreds of deaths. But behind every number was a person. A child who had a favourite toy, a family who had plans for the next day, a bedroom that was supposed to be a place of safety. The Victorian floods were not only disasters of water, they were disasters of ordinary life interrupted. Because the most frightening thing about a flood is not always the water itself. It is the moment when you realise that the place where you feel safest was never as safe as you believed. And for some Victorian families, The cruelest surprise was that the sound of water approaching in the night was not the sound of rain. It was the sound of everything changing before they had even opened their eyes. After the Great Stink finally embarrassed Parliament into action, the job of fixing London's sewage crisis fell to one man, Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. His plan was breathtakingly ambitious. He would build over 80 miles of interconnecting brick-lined sewers beneath the city, intercepting the waste before it reached the Thames and carrying it far downstream to be dumped on the outgoing tide. As you imagine yourself standing above London in the middle of the 19th century, the scale of the problem becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Millions of people are living, working, and producing waste inside one of the largest cities on Earth, while the systems designed to handle that waste belong to a much smaller and older city. London had grown faster than anyone expected. The streets expanded, the houses multiplied, the factories increased. But beneath all of this progress was a hidden disaster, waiting patiently underground. Every day the city produced an enormous amount of waste. Every day much of it moved through drains, cesspits and waterways that eventually emptied into the Thames. The river had become London's unofficial waste disposal system. A terrible system, a disgusting system, but a system that had somehow continued for decades because everyone was too busy building the future to notice the consequences underneath their feet. Then came the Great Stink. Suddenly, the problem was impossible to ignore. When the smell of the Thames reached Parliament, sanitation stopped being something discussed only by doctors, reformers, and residents of poor neighbourhoods. The people making decisions could no longer pretend the problem belonged somewhere else. The river had arrived at their doorstep, literally, and that is often when governments become surprisingly interested in solving problems, when the problem starts affecting them. Joseph Bazalgette was given the enormous task of transforming London's entire approach to sewage. This was not a small repair job. He was not fixing a broken pipe under one street, or cleaning out a blocked drain. He was redesigning the underground structure of an entire capital city, a slightly ambitious weekend project. Bazalgette understood that the solution required more than simply removing waste. London needed a completely new system that could handle the city's growing population while preventing sewage from entering the Thames. His answer was a massive network of intercepting sewers. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of allowing waste to flow directly into the river, the new sewers would collect it and transport it away from central London. The system would redirect sewage toward treatment points and out toward the river's lower reaches, where tides could carry it away from the city. It was a huge engineering challenge. London was already crowded. Buildings stood everywhere. Roads were busy. Railways crossed the landscape. Somehow, Bazalgette had to build an entirely new city beneath the existing one, because apparently one London was not enough. The project required enormous amounts of excavation. Workers dug through streets, moved earth, laid brick tunnels, and constructed pumping stations. Much of the work was done manually, under difficult conditions. The underground environment was dangerous. Workers dealt with poor ventilation, unstable ground, and the constant challenge of building beneath an active city. Above them, London continued as normal. People walked to work, businesses operated, carriages moved through streets, and below all of that activity, thousands of workers were creating the hidden infrastructure that would determine whether the city could survive. This was one of the defining characteristics of Victorian engineering. The most important achievements were often the ones people rarely saw. A bridge is visible, a railway station is impressive, a giant building attracts attention. But a sewer system, people generally prefer not to think about the thing carrying away everything they would rather forget. Which is exactly why Bazalgette's work was so important. He understood that sanitation was not just about removing unpleasant material. It was about designing a city capable of supporting millions of people. The sewer system became one of the foundations of modern London, and ironically it began with a problem that many people had spent years avoiding: the smell. Bazalgette was not only an engineer, he was also a careful planner. He designed the system with future growth in mind. London was expanding rapidly, and he knew a solution that worked only for the current population would quickly become another failure. So he built larger capacity than immediately necessary. This was one of his smartest decisions. At the time, some people questioned the expense. Why build something bigger than required? Why spend extra money on underground tunnels that seemed excessive? The answer was simple: because cities have a habit of becoming larger, a lesson that seems obvious now, but apparently needed to be tested. Bazalgette calculated that London's population would continue increasing, and his system needed to handle future demand. The extra capacity helped the sewers continue functioning long after his original plans were completed. It was a rare example of an engineer looking ahead rather than simply solving today's problem. A revolutionary concept, almost suspiciously reasonable. The new sewer network also helped reduce flooding problems. By creating better drainage and moving waste away more efficiently, the system improved the city's ability to handle heavy rainfall. It did not eliminate flooding completely. No sewer system can defeat every storm. Water will always find weaknesses, especially when cities continue expanding. But it dramatically improved London's resilience. The transformation was enormous. The Thames, once described as an open sewer, gradually became cleaner. The worst conditions of the mid-19th century began to improve. Public health benefited. The risk of waterborne diseases decreased. A problem that had seemed impossible began to look manageable. And all because someone finally decided that perhaps allowing an entire city to empty itself into a river was not the greatest long-term strategy. Bazalgette's work also represented a change in how people thought about cities. A city was not just buildings and roads. It was a complicated machine where every part affected every other part. Water supply, waste removal, transportation, housing, public health. Everything was connected. Ignore one system, and the others eventually suffer. The Great Stink had revealed this connection in the most unpleasant way possible, but Bazalgette showed that engineering could repair what poor planning had created. As you walk through modern London today, you rarely think about the enormous brick tunnels beneath the streets. You probably think about buildings, landmarks, shops, and roads. You do not think about the hidden network quietly carrying away millions of people's waste every day, which is exactly how a successful sewer system should work. The best ones are invisible. They do their job quietly. They never demand attention. They never appear in tourist brochures. Nobody takes a romantic photo beside a sewage tunnel and says, "This changed civilization." But perhaps they should, because cities depend on these hidden systems more than almost anything else. Bazalgette did not save London with a dramatic battle or a famous speech. He saved it with calculations, bricks, tunnels, and a willingness to solve a problem that everyone else had spent years pretending was not there. He looked at a city drowning in its own waste and decided the answer was not to complain about the smell. It was to build something better, and perhaps that is the most Victorian thing about the entire story. A society that could create enormous factories, powerful machines, and a global empire eventually discovered that one of its greatest achievements was simply figuring out where to put the rubbish. Because sometimes the difference between a thriving city and a complete disaster is not a revolutionary invention. Sometimes it is just having somewhere for everything unpleasant to go. Bazalgette's sewer project didn't just hide pipes underground. It reshaped the river itself. The Victoria Embankment, the Albert Embankment, and the Chelsea Embankment were massive stone walls built along the Thames, narrowing the river, reclaiming land, and creating a physical barrier between London and its most dangerous neighbour. The embankments were engineering marvels. They housed the new sewers, a subway line, gas and water mains, all buried beneath elegant promenades lined with trees. As you stand beside the Thames before these embankments existed, the relationship between London and the river looks very different. The city is powerful, crowded, and constantly expanding, but the river still moves according to its own rules. When the tide rises, the water pushes into the city. When heavy rain arrives, the river swells. When storms combine with poor drainage, London discovers that its greatest waterway can also become one of its greatest threats. The Thames was not simply a beautiful feature running through the capital. It was a problem waiting for the right weather. For centuries, London had grown around the river because the river was useful. It provided transportation, trade routes, and access to water. Ships arrived carrying goods from across the world. Businesses developed along the banks. People built their lives around the opportunities created by the Thames. But living beside a river comes with a small disadvantage. The river occasionally remembers that it is a river, and rivers are not famous for respecting property boundaries. Before the embankments, parts of the Thames waterfront were chaotic and poorly organised. Buildings crowded close to the water, wharves extended into the river, streets were narrow and irregular. The boundary between land and water was constantly changing. During high tides and floods, the river could spill into low-lying areas. The problem became worse as London expanded and more people built closer to the Thames. The city wanted the advantages of the river. It just did not enjoy the moments when the river wanted some space back. Bazalgette's embankment projects addressed several problems at once. They were not simply flood defences. They were part of a larger transformation of London's infrastructure. The embankments created stronger control over the river's edge. They helped manage flooding, improve sanitation, and provided space for essential underground systems. This was one of the great strengths of Victorian engineering. The engineers looked at one problem and somehow discovered 5 more problems hiding underneath it. Then they decided to solve all of them simultaneously. The Victoria Embankment, completed in the 1870s, was perhaps the most famous of these projects. It stretched along the north bank of the Thames and created a grand new riverside area. Above ground, it appeared elegant, a beautiful promenade, a carefully planned street, a place where Londoners could walk beside the river. Below ground, however, was where the real work was happening. The embankment contained part of Bazalgette's sewer system, along with other important utilities. Gas pipes, water mains, and railway infrastructure were integrated beneath the surface. To the people walking above, it looked like a pleasant public space. Underneath, it was basically the world's most sophisticated underground storage cupboard. Except instead of storing old furniture and forgotten boxes, it was carrying the essential systems keeping a giant city alive. The engineering challenge was enormous. Building beside a tidal river required careful planning. Workers had to construct a stable foundation while dealing with the movement of water. The river itself had to be managed during construction. You're essentially trying to build a wall, while standing beside a giant moving force that would happily ruin your progress if given the opportunity. The Victorians responded with a familiar strategy: build something extremely large. They used massive amounts of materials, including stone and concrete, to create structures strong enough to withstand the pressure of the river. The embankments pushed the river into a more controlled channel, while creating valuable new land along the waterfront. This was a common Victorian approach. If nature created a challenge, the answer was often to reshape nature. Need transportation? Build a railway. Need cleaner streets? Build a sewer system. Need the river to stop flooding? Build a giant wall beside it. Simple. Possibly too simple, but often effective. The embankments changed London's relationship with the Thames. The river became less threatening and more controlled. The city could expand with greater confidence because one of its biggest problems had been physically managed. Flooding was not eliminated completely. Rivers remain rivers. Heavy storms and extreme conditions can still create problems. But the embankments significantly reduced the vulnerability of central London. They were a reminder that successful engineering does not always mean defeating nature. Sometimes it means creating a better relationship with it. The embankments also had another important effect. They transformed the appearance of the city. Victorian London was not only interested in function, it also cared deeply about presentation. The empire's capital wanted to look impressive. Grand streets, public buildings, and carefully designed spaces reflected national confidence. The embankments fit perfectly into this vision. They solved a practical problem while creating something beautiful. A rare moment where infrastructure and aesthetics actually agreed. Usually the thing keeping a city alive is not the thing people want to admire. Nobody gathers around a drainage pipe and says, "What a magnificent example of human achievement." But the embankments managed to make necessary infrastructure visible and impressive. They turned flood protection into architecture. They turned sewage management into urban design. Which is a very Victorian way of making something unpleasant look respectable. The projects also demonstrated a major shift in how governments approach cities. Urban problems were becoming too large for individuals to solve. Flooding, sanitation, transportation, and public health required coordinated planning. The modern city was beginning to emerge. a place where underground systems mattered as much as buildings above ground, a place where engineering decisions shaped everyday life. The embankments represented this new thinking. They were not just walls, they were evidence that cities could be designed intentionally rather than simply growing randomly. As you walk along the Thames today, it is easy to forget what existed before these structures. The river appears orderly, the roads are organised. The waterfront feels permanent, but that stability was created. It was not natural. It came from thousands of workers, millions of bricks, and years of planning. The city you see is built on layers of hidden decisions. Some are obvious, some are underground, some are literally holding back a river. And perhaps the most interesting part is that many people never notice them. A successful piece of infrastructure becomes invisible because everything works. The flood does not happen. The sewage does not overflow. The city continues. Nobody thinks about the disaster that did not occur. But that is the entire point. The embankments were designed to prevent the moments when London would remember how vulnerable it really was. They were barriers against water, but they were also barriers against chaos. Because Victorian London had learned an important lesson. A city cannot simply grow larger and hope its problems disappear. Eventually the problems catch up. Sometimes they arrive as a terrible smell from the river. Sometimes they arrive as floodwater entering your home. And sometimes, thankfully, they arrive as an engineer with a very ambitious plan and enough bricks to build a wall between civilization and the river trying to reclaim it. Despite the new embankments, the Thames was not finished with London. The river flooded regularly throughout the later Victorian period, sometimes breaching the very walls designed to contain it. In 1874 and 1875, the East End neighbourhood of Wapping was flooded so severely that boats navigated up and down the high street with 5 feet of water beneath them. Families living in basement apartments found their kitchens filled to the ceiling. As you stand in Wapping during one of these floods, the first thing you realise is that the city has not been defeated completely. It has simply been reminded who is stronger. The embankments, sewers and new infrastructure had dramatically improved London's ability to manage water, but they did not transform the Thames into a perfectly obedient decorative feature. The river was still a natural force moving through the centre of a massive city. It still rose, it still flowed, it still occasionally looked at human engineering and decided it had other plans. This was the challenge of living beside one of the world's most important rivers. The Thames was essential to London's success, but it was never truly under London's control. The same waterway that brought trade, transportation and wealth could also bring destruction when conditions aligned. The Victorian dream was to organise nature. The reality was that nature occasionally refused to cooperate. Wapping was especially vulnerable because of its location along the eastern side of London. The area had long been connected to maritime activity. Ships, warehouses, docks and workers filled the neighbourhood. It was a place built around the river, which meant the river was always nearby. Very nearby. Almost too nearby. The flooding in 1874 and 1875 revealed the limits of London's defences. The new systems had solved many problems, but they could not eliminate every risk. Extreme tides, heavy rainfall and high river levels could still overwhelm local areas. Water found the weak points. It always does. During severe flooding, the streets of Wapping changed completely. Roads designed for pedestrians, carts and horses became waterways. The familiar sounds of daily life were replaced by the movement of boats and the constant splash of rising water. A high street with 5 feet of water running through it was not exactly the kind of urban transformation planners usually aim for, although, from a distance, it was probably a fascinating demonstration of how quickly a city could accidentally become a canal system. Residents faced enormous disruption, homes filled with water, furniture was damaged, supplies were ruined, basements, which were common living spaces for poorer families, were especially vulnerable. And this created one of the cruelest aspects of Victorian flooding. The people who suffered the most were often those with the fewest options. A wealthy homeowner might have been inconvenienced by flooding. A working-class family could lose almost everything. Basement apartments were common because they were cheaper and easier to rent. They were often damp even under normal conditions, with limited light and poor ventilation. Then the Thames arrived. Imagine waking up to discover that your home is slowly filling with river water. Your belongings are soaked, your bedding is ruined, The food you stored is damaged. The space where your family lives is no longer a home. It is a container for floodwater. And unfortunately, Victorian renters did not have the luxury of simply searching for a better apartment with excellent flood resistance and modern plumbing. Those were not exactly common features in 19th century housing advertisements. The flooding also demonstrated an important reality about urban defences. A city is not protected by one single solution. The embankments helped, the sewers helped, improved drainage helped, but every system had limits. A wall can hold back water, a sewer can carry water away. But if enough water arrives at once, the city still has to deal with it. Modern cities continue facing the same challenge. Flood defences reduce risk, but they do not make cities invincible. Water is patient, it searches for openings, it moves around obstacles, and it has far more time than humans do. Victorian London learned that engineering was not about creating complete victory over nature. It was about reducing the damage when nature inevitably pushed back. The floods of Wapping also highlighted the continuing tension between London's growth and its environment. The city was expanding rapidly, with more buildings, more people, and more infrastructure placed near vulnerable areas. Every new development increased opportunity. It also increased exposure. The more valuable the riverside became, the more people depended on controlling the river. The Thames was no longer just a waterway. It was a partner, a transportation route, an industrial resource, a source of drinking water, a waste channel, and occasionally an extremely inconvenient neighbour. The Victorian response to flooding continued to evolve. Authorities improved drainage, raised concerns about vulnerable areas, and developed better approaches to managing the river. But complete control remained impossible. The floods served as reminders that even the greatest engineering projects existed within natural systems. You could build walls, you could redirect flows, you could construct enormous underground networks, but you could not convince water that it should stop behaving like water. Perhaps that was the most important lesson. Victorian engineers were not failures because floods continued after their improvements. In fact, their work prevented countless disasters that might otherwise have happened. The goal was never perfection. The goal was survival. A city without defences might flood constantly. A city with defences might flood occasionally. That difference is the reason engineering matters. The embankments did not create an unstoppable London. They created a stronger London, a city better prepared for the moments when the river decided to remind everyone that it had existed long before the buildings around it. As you look at Wapping during those floods, the image is almost surreal. Boats moving along streets, families looking out from flooded homes, a neighbourhood transformed into a temporary waterfront. The modern eye might find the scene strangely fascinating. The residents living through it probably found it significantly less charming. There is a certain irony in watching a city built around controlling water discover that water is still capable of causing problems. London had spent decades trying to organise the Thames. The river responded by occasionally rearranging the furniture, and that was the ongoing relationship between Victorian cities and flooding. Humans built, water tested, humans rebuilt, water returned, a never-ending conversation between ambition and gravity. The Victorians had learned how to fight floods better than any previous generation. But they also learned something more humbling. You can build stronger walls, you can design better systems, you can create incredible engineering achievements. But somewhere, eventually the river will still remind you that it was there first. And it has a very long memory. Floodwater in a Victorian city was not just water, it was a biological weapon. When the waters receded, they left behind a thin film of sewage, industrial waste, and decomposing organic matter that coated every surface it had touched. The damp seeped into walls, into furniture, into bedding. Within days, the real killing began. Typhoid fever, dysentery and cholera swept through flooded neighbourhoods with terrifying efficiency. As you walk through a Victorian neighbourhood after the flood has disappeared, the first thing you notice is that the danger seems to be gone. The streets are no longer rivers. The water has drained away. People begin cleaning, doors open. Families return to their homes. Life appears to be returning to normal. But the flood has left something behind. Not just mud, not just damaged furniture. Something far more dangerous. A Victorian flood was not an event that ended when the water disappeared. In many ways, the water leaving was only the beginning of the next disaster. The reason was simple. The flood had collected everything. A modern flood might already be unpleasant. Rainwater rushing through streets, damaging property and destroying belongings is enough to create chaos. But Victorian city floodwater was something else entirely. It moved through open drains, overflowing cesspits, industrial yards, slaughterhouses and crowded neighbourhoods. It picked up whatever the city had thrown away and carried it wherever gravity decided. The flood became a moving mixture of everything London, Manchester, Sheffield, and other industrial cities were desperately trying not to think about. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food, chemical runoff, dead animals, contaminated soil, all combined into one extremely unpleasant delivery service from nature, and unfortunately, the delivery came directly to people's homes. When the water settled, it left contamination everywhere. Floors, walls, carpets, clothing and furniture absorbed the filthy mixture. Wooden structures soaked it in. Cellars remained damp. The smell lingered for weeks. Imagine returning home after a flood and discovering that your house has been transformed into a damp museum, dedicated to everything disgusting that was previously outside. Your furniture is ruined, your walls are stained, your possessions smell like the entire city had a terrible day and decided to leave evidence behind. And the worst part was that Victorian families often did not have the resources to simply throw everything away and start over. For poorer residents, damaged furniture was not an inconvenience, it was a financial disaster. A flooded home could mean lost bedding, ruined clothing, spoiled food, and expensive repairs that families could not afford. Many returned to houses that were technically standing but no longer healthy places to live. The damp conditions created perfect environments for disease. Victorian doctors understood that dirty conditions were connected to illness, but many still believed in the theory of miasma, the idea that diseases spread through foul-smelling air. And to be fair, when you walk through a flooded Victorian neighbourhood, the air probably did seem like a reasonable suspect. The smell was horrifying. The streets looked terrible. Everything around you suggested that something dangerous was present. The mistake was identifying the wrong thing. The problem was not simply the smell. The problem was what the smell represented. Contaminated water carried microorganisms that could enter the body and cause severe illness. Flooding allowed those contaminants to spread rapidly through neighbourhoods, especially where sanitation systems were already poor. Cholera was one of the most feared diseases of the Victorian period. It caused severe diarrhoea and dehydration, often killing victims within hours or days. In communities where drinking water was contaminated with sewage, outbreaks could spread quickly. The tragedy was that people often did not understand exactly why it happened. They could see the dirty water, they could smell the decay, they could witness entire families becoming sick. But without knowledge of bacteria and transmission, the connection between sewage contamination and disease remained unclear for many years. It was like watching someone repeatedly step on a trap without knowing the trap existed. Except the trap was invisible, and it was inside the drinking water. Typhoid fever created another major threat. Like cholera, it was linked to contaminated food and water. Symptoms included fever, weakness, and severe illness. Dysentery also spread through poor sanitation, causing dangerous intestinal infections. For residents of flooded Victorian neighbourhoods, the danger did not end when the river went down. The flood had changed the environment. It had moved contamination into places where people lived. It had turned ordinary objects into potential sources of illness: a wet floor, a damp blanket, a contaminated water supply. Everything became part of the problem. The poorest communities suffered most because they were already facing unhealthy conditions before the flood arrived. Overcrowded housing, limited access to clean water, and inadequate sanitation meant there was less protection against disease outbreaks. A flood did not create inequality, it exposed it. A wealthy household might have the money to repair damage, replace belongings, and temporarily leave the affected area. A poor family might have no choice but to remain in a damp, contaminated home. The same water affected everyone. The consequences were not the same. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout Victorian cities. Environmental disasters often became health disasters because urban systems were not prepared to protect vulnerable populations. Flooding revealed weaknesses that existed long before the rain began. It showed the consequences of crowded housing. It showed the dangers of poor sanitation. It showed what happened when cities expanded faster than their infrastructure could handle. But these disasters also pushed society toward change. Public health reformers used evidence from outbreaks to argue for cleaner water supplies, better sewage systems, and improved housing conditions. Engineers and scientists began understanding that disease was connected to contamination rather than simply unpleasant smells. The discovery of germ theory would eventually transform medicine and public health. But before that knowledge became widespread, many people had already learned the lesson through painful experience. The water itself was not the enemy. It was what the water carried. That was the terrifying part. A flood was visible. You could see the river rising. You could watch the streets fill. You could measure the damage. But the diseases that followed were invisible. They arrived quietly. They entered homes without knocking. They spread through things people touched every day. A cup, a plate, a blanket, a hand. The flood announced itself loudly. The illness whispered. And sometimes the whisper was far more dangerous. As you look back at Victorian flooding, the greatest tragedy is that the disaster continued long after the water disappeared. The streets dried. The rivers returned to their banks. The buildings remained standing. But the consequences moved through communities in ways nobody could immediately see. The Victorians built walls against rivers. They built sewers beneath cities. They redesigned entire landscapes. But one of the hardest battles was against something much smaller, something invisible, something carried quietly in the very water people depended on. Because the most dangerous thing about Victorian floods was never just that they could drown a city. It was that even after the city stopped drowning, the water could still keep fighting. After a Victorian flood receded, it left something behind. Not just water stains or damaged furniture, but mud. Thick, black, stinking mud that coated everything from floor to ceiling. This was not ordinary mud. It was a concentrated slurry of everything the floodwater had carried through the streets. Sewage, animal waste, industrial chemicals, decomposing matter, and the general accumulated filth of a city that produced more waste than it could ever hope to manage. As you step back into your home after the floodwaters have finally withdrawn, you might expect relief. Instead, you are greeted by silence. Not the comforting kind. The exhausted silence that follows chaos, when the river has gone home but thoughtfully left all of its luggage behind. The floor no longer reflects the ceiling with standing water. Your chair is no longer floating across the room like it has suddenly developed maritime ambitions. The walls are still standing. The roof has survived. Technically, the house is still there. Practically, it now resembles the inside of a neglected chimney, mixed with the world's least successful soup kitchen. The smell reaches you before your eyes fully adjust. It hangs in the air, heavy and damp, clinging to every breath. Wet earth mixes with sewage, rotting vegetation, coal soot, stagnant water, spoiled food, and the unmistakable odour of things that should never have shared the same bucket. You instinctively breathe through your mouth, a decision you regret almost immediately. The mud covers everything, every floorboard, every stair, every cupboard, every blanket, every plate left on the table before the flood arrived. It settles in corners, squeezes into cracks, coats door frames, and dries in uneven ridges that record exactly how high the floodwater climbed. The walls were a dark horizontal line like the city itself has been measured by misery. Modern people often speak about cleaning up after a flood as though it involves a mop, some disinfectant and perhaps an insurance claim. Victorians would have considered that adorable. There was no industrial carpet cleaner waiting around the corner, no dehumidifier humming quietly in the background, no restoration company arriving in matching uniforms promising to make everything look like new. There was only you, a bucket, perhaps a stiff brush, and enough contaminated mud to keep you employed until Christmas, assuming the flood had not already ruined Christmas. The consistency of this mud made it particularly difficult to remove. It was thick enough to cling stubbornly to surfaces, but wet enough to spread the moment you tried scraping it away. Every footprint created another smear. Every attempt to carry furniture outside left another trail across the floor. Cleaning became less like removing dirt and more like negotiating with an extremely determined pudding, one that had somehow become sentient and deeply resented your efforts. The floodwater had acted as a giant mixing bowl, collecting material from every corner of the city before thoughtfully redistributing it into people's homes. The contents were astonishing. Horse manure from busy streets, ash from thousands of fireplaces, coal dust drifting from factories, human waste washed out of overflowing cesspits, animal remains from slaughterhouses, leather scraps from tanneries, rotting vegetables from market stalls, grease from workshops, dead rats carried along by the current, and ordinary soil churned together into a dense black paste. Every neighbourhood contributed something. The flood believed firmly in community participation. You could almost think of it as London's first citywide recycling programme, except nothing was actually recycled, and everyone hated it. For working-class families, the clean-up began almost immediately because waiting was not an option. Missing several days of work could mean losing wages needed for rent or food. Yet returning to work while leaving the house untouched meant children and elderly relatives remained inside contaminated rooms. Neither choice was particularly appealing. Victorian life had a remarkable ability to present impossible decisions and then charge you rent anyway. You kneel to scrub the floor. The wood feels swollen beneath your hands. The grain has lifted where water soaked into it. Mud fills every gap between the boards. Every scrape of the brush produces another foul-smelling puddle. You empty the bucket. The water turns black almost instantly. Then you begin again. The walls are no better. Wallpaper, if the family was fortunate enough to have any, peels away in damp strips. Plaster softens and crumbles. Moisture seeps deep into the brickwork, refusing to leave even after the visible water disappears. Weeks later, the walls still feel cold and clammy. Months later, they may still smell faintly of the river. It is astonishing how determined bad smells can be. They possess the commitment of a Victorian tax collector. Furniture suffers its own quiet tragedy. Wooden tables warp, chairs loosen. Drawers swell shut. Mattresses absorb foul water like enormous unhappy sponges. Imagine trying to sleep on bedding that spent 2 days marinating in a mixture of river water and 19th century sanitation. Suddenly, insomnia begins to sound less like a medical condition and more like perfectly reasonable self-preservation. Food stores rarely survived. Bread dissolved into grey paste. Flour became heavy lumps. Salt absorbed moisture until it resembled damp sand. Vegetables rotted. Anything stored in a cellar was almost certainly lost. The family pantry transformed from a source of comfort into a scientific demonstration of decomposition. The poorest households often owned very little to begin with. That somehow made losing everything even worse. A family possessing only one table, 4 chairs, a bed, and a small cupboard could see nearly all of their worldly possessions ruined in a single night. Disaster does not require luxury to create heartbreak. Sometimes it only needs enough water to reach the floor. Children wandered through the aftermath carefully, stepping around piles of ruined belongings while adults tried to salvage whatever remained. Toys carved from wood were scrubbed clean if possible. Clothing was washed repeatedly, though clean water itself was often difficult to obtain. Even after hours of work, nothing looked truly clean. The mud had a remarkable ability to leave reminders. Dark stains remained beneath fingernails. Boots carried dried clumps into newly cleaned rooms. The smell settled into fabric. Every object became a souvenir from the flood. Outside, the streets looked little better. Thick deposits covered cobblestones, making walking difficult. Cartwheels sank into sticky sludge. Horses slipped. Workers shoveled endless piles of contaminated sediment into carts, only for another rain shower to spread whatever remained. Cleaning an entire Victorian neighbourhood was like attempting to empty the sea with a teacup. Respectable effort. Questionable odds. Public officials gradually realised that removing floodwater was only half the battle. Clearing away the mud became essential to restoring public health. Leaving it in place meant continued exposure to contamination, foul odours, insects, and disease. The mud itself became another stage of the disaster, not dramatic, not fast, just relentlessly unpleasant. It lingered in places people could not easily reach, beneath floorboards, inside wells, around foundations, in narrow alleys where sunlight barely penetrated. Every damp corner became another reminder that floods had a long memory, and so did buildings. Long after newspapers stopped reporting the flood, families continued scraping walls, replacing rotten timber, airing blankets, and wondering whether the smell would ever disappear completely. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it merely faded enough that people stopped noticing. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. Given enough time, we can become accustomed to almost anything. Even living in a house that smells faintly like a damp horse wearing sewage as aftershave. As you finally close the door at the end of another exhausting day of cleaning, your hands ache, your clothes are stained beyond recognition, and your home is only marginally less filthy than it was that morning. Still, progress is progress. Victorian flooding was never simply about surviving the water. It was about surviving everything the water politely decided to leave behind. Because while rivers eventually return to their banks, the mud has a far less ambitious travel schedule. Once it moves into your house, it behaves very much like an unexpected relative. It settles in, refuses to leave, and somehow makes every room smell worse. When Victorian floods destroyed homes and livelihoods, there was no government disaster relief, no emergency housing, and no insurance for the poor. If you were wealthy enough to own property, you might have had some form of coverage, though early insurance policies were notoriously vague about what counted as an act of God versus an act of negligence. If you were a tenant, which most flood victims were, you were simply out of luck. As you stand outside what remains of your home after the flood, you naturally begin wondering what happens next. Surely someone will help. Surely there must be a government office keeping track of families who have just watched half their possessions float away. Surely there is a relief fund, a temporary shelter, an emergency payment, perhaps even a sympathetic official carrying blankets and hot soup. Instead, you receive something much more authentically Victorian. Silence. The 19th century believed strongly in personal responsibility. This was an age that admired hard work, thrift, and self-reliance. These were admirable qualities under ordinary circumstances. Floodwater, unfortunately, has never shown much interest in political philosophy. When disaster struck, the expectation was often that individuals, families, churches, charities, employers, or local communities would provide assistance. The central government generally played a much smaller role in disaster relief than people expect today. This was not because Victorians were incapable of compassion. Many were extraordinarily generous, but generosity and organised public assistance are not the same thing. If your neighbours had enough to spare, they might help. If your local church organised collections, you might receive clothing or food. If a wealthy benefactor decided your town deserved assistance, donations might arrive. If none of those things happened, your recovery plan became remarkably straightforward. Try not to starve. The experience differed dramatically depending on your place in society. If you owned a substantial home and had the financial means to insure it, there was at least the possibility of compensation. Fire insurance had existed for quite some time, and during the 19th century some insurers also covered certain types of property damage. The important word there is some. Insurance policies could be wonderfully creative when it came to explaining why this particular disaster was regrettably not covered. The wording often distinguished between unavoidable natural events and damage caused by poor maintenance or negligence. Establishing where one ended and the other began could become surprisingly complicated. Did the flood result from extraordinary weather, or because someone failed to maintain a drainage channel? Did a dam collapse because of nature, or because of defective construction? The answers mattered enormously, especially if someone else was paying. Imagine opening your policy after the flood has destroyed your home, only to discover that the document contains enough careful wording to make a lawyer develop a headache. Apparently the water reached your dining room, but not the relevant paragraph. For tenants, however, these legal arguments were largely academic. Most working-class families rented their homes. They owned very little property beyond furniture, clothing, bedding, cooking utensils, and perhaps a few treasured possessions collected over many years. None of those things came with meaningful protection. If they were destroyed, they were simply destroyed. You begin cleaning because there is no alternative. Your landlord may repair structural damage eventually, assuming the building is worth repairing. Your chair, your blankets, your children's clothes. Those remain your responsibility, even though the river made the decisions. The injustice feels almost mathematical. The people with the least were often those who lost the highest proportion of everything they owned. A prosperous merchant might lose part of his wealth. A labourer's family might lose nearly all of it. The flood did not discriminate. Recovery certainly did. Many Victorian landlords were under no obligation to provide replacement accommodation after flooding. Some repaired damaged properties, others delayed repairs. Some tenants simply left, searching for another room they could barely afford. Finding new housing was rarely easy. Industrial cities already suffered severe overcrowding. Vacant rooms were scarce. Dry vacant rooms were practically mythical. You could almost imagine them being discussed the way people speak about unicorns. I've heard tales of a cellar without damp. Impossible. Yet my cousin swears he saw one once. Employment created another cruel complication. If your workshop flooded, you could not work. If your employer's factory flooded, you could not work. If roads remained impassable, you could not reach work. No work meant no wages. No wages meant no rent. No rent created another problem entirely. Victorian poverty possessed a remarkable ability to multiply itself. One disaster rarely arrived alone. The flood damaged your house. Missing work damaged your income. Poor sanitation damaged your health. Medical bills damaged your savings. Eventually you found yourself wondering whether the river accepted apologies in place of money. It did not. Communities often organised charitable appeals after major floods. Newspapers published lists of donors. Public subscriptions raised money for affected families. Churches distributed food, clothing, and household necessities. These efforts genuinely helped many survivors. But charity depended upon circumstance. Some disasters attracted widespread public sympathy. Others faded quickly from attention. And charity, generous though it might be, could never guarantee fairness. It depended upon generosity rather than entitlement. Victorian society often viewed poverty through a moral lens. People debated whether individuals deserved assistance based upon their behaviour, character, or industriousness. Floods complicated these assumptions. It was difficult to argue that a sleeping child deserved to lose a home because of poor personal choices. The water had not checked anyone's moral record before entering. It simply flowed downhill. Large disasters such as the Sheffield flood prompted legal disputes over responsibility. Survivors sought compensation from those connected with the failed reservoir. Court cases examined engineering decisions, construction standards, and liability. These proceedings could continue for years. Justice, like Victorian public transport, was not always especially fast. Some compensation was eventually awarded after the Sheffield disaster, but money arrived long after lives had already been shattered, and no payment could restore those who had been lost. The flood forced society to confront uncomfortable questions. When technology fails, who pays? When infrastructure collapses, where does responsibility begin? Does progress carry obligations, or only profits? These questions remain surprisingly familiar. Modern governments generally provide emergency relief because history demonstrated the consequences of leaving disaster recovery entirely to luck, charity, or private wealth. Victorian floods became part of that lesson. People gradually recognised that rebuilding communities required more than individual determination. It required organised support. As you walk through a flood-damaged street, you notice people helping one another despite their own losses. Neighbours carry furniture from ruined houses, shopkeepers extend credit, churches open their doors, volunteers distribute bread and blankets. Human kindness appears where official systems struggle. That generosity deserves remembering. Because while Victorian institutions were often inadequate, Victorian communities frequently refused to surrender entirely. Ordinary people became each other's safety net, not because life was fair, because it clearly was not. There is another irony hiding beneath all this misery. Victorian Britain was one of the richest and most industrially advanced nations in the world. Its factories supplied global markets. Its ships crossed every ocean. Its railways represented engineering brilliance. Yet after a flood, countless families depended upon neighbours passing around a collection tin. Progress had conquered continents. It was still working on disaster recovery. As evening falls, you sit among damp walls, salvaged possessions, and uncertain prospects. Tomorrow you will continue cleaning. You will search for work if work remains. You will repair what can be repaired and quietly mourn what cannot. No official arrives promising everything will be made right. There is only the stubborn determination to begin again. That, perhaps more than anything else, defined the Victorian experience. They built extraordinary cities. They endured extraordinary disasters. And when the water finally receded, they often discovered that the hardest part was not surviving the flood. It was surviving the paperwork that never really existed in the first place. Because in Victorian Britain, the river might destroy your home overnight, but the universe would still somehow find a way to suggest you should have planned better. Not everyone in Victorian Britain accepted flooding and disease as inevitable. A small but determined group of reformers, scientists and journalists spent decades pushing for change. Edwin Chadwick, the fiery public health campaigner, published reports so graphic about living conditions in industrial cities that they made members of Parliament physically ill. Henry Mayhew described cellar dwellers wading through sewage. Charles Dickens wove the horrors of urban poverty into novels that reached millions. As you continue your journey through Victorian Britain, it would be easy to believe everyone simply accepted flooded streets, poisoned rivers, and overflowing cesspits as an unavoidable part of modern life. After all, when you spend your childhood stepping over open drains on the way to school, your definition of normal becomes remarkably flexible. But not everyone was willing to shrug, wrinkle their nose, and carry on. Some people looked at the filth surrounding Britain's great cities and came to an uncomfortable conclusion. This was not inevitable. It was preventable. That idea sounds perfectly ordinary today. Of course governments should improve sanitation. Of course clean drinking water matters. Of course cities should not routinely marinate their residents in sewage. In Victorian Britain, however, these were surprisingly radical positions, partly because solving the problem would cost an extraordinary amount of money, and partly because admitting there was a problem meant admitting decades of astonishing industrial success had come with some rather unfortunate side effects. Edwin Chadwick was among the most influential voices demanding reform. Originally trained in law and deeply interested in social administration, Chadwick became convinced that poor sanitation lay at the heart of Britain's public health crisis. He was not especially famous for being subtle. When he wanted people's attention, he generally obtained it. His great investigation into the sanitary conditions of Britain's labouring population, published in 1842, gathered evidence from across the country. Doctors, engineers, local officials and inspectors described overcrowded housing, contaminated water, overflowing drains and streets thick with refuse. The reports painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Entire families crowded into damp cellar rooms, open cesspits leaking into wells, children growing up beside stagnant pools filled with waste, neighbourhoods where disease returned so regularly that people almost expected it. Reading the report was rather like opening a modern restaurant review that begins with the words, "The soup appears to be alive." Technically informative, not especially reassuring. Chadwick believed that improving sanitation would save lives while reducing the long-term costs of caring for the sick. Cleaner streets, reliable drainage, proper sewer systems and fresh water were not simply moral improvements. They were economic ones. Healthy workers missed fewer days. Healthy children survived into adulthood. Healthy cities functioned more efficiently. It was an argument that appealed not only to compassion, but also to accountants. A surprisingly effective combination. His reports shocked many readers because they replaced vague rumours with precise observation. It is one thing to suspect that slums are unpleasant. It is another to read detailed descriptions explaining exactly how rainwater mixed with sewage before flowing into the same wells people used for drinking. Suddenly, ignorance became much harder to maintain. Henry Mayhew approached the problem differently. Rather than focusing primarily on official investigations, he spent time speaking directly with the people living in London's poorest districts. His remarkable work documented street vendors, labourers, children, and families struggling to survive in the capital. Instead of treating the poor as statistics, he treated them as human beings. Imagine that. A surprisingly revolutionary journalistic technique. Mayhew walked streets many wealthier Londoners avoided. He entered overcrowded neighbourhoods, interviewed workers, and recorded their experiences with remarkable detail. His descriptions of cellar dwellings and flood-prone housing revealed conditions that many readers had never imagined. You could not comfortably dismiss the suffering once someone had carefully described it. Readers encountered families sleeping below street level while water seeped through walls. They learned about rooms permanently damp, about children growing up without sunlight, and about sewage appearing inside homes whenever heavy rain arrived. It became increasingly difficult to argue that poverty resulted entirely from laziness when the ceiling itself was dripping onto the bed. Charles Dickens fought the same battle through fiction. Unlike Chadwick's official reports or Mayhew's journalism, Dickens reached readers through stories. His novels introduced millions of people to characters navigating overcrowded cities, unfair institutions, and crushing poverty. He understood something powerful. Facts persuade the mind. Stories persuade the heart. In novels such as Bleak House and Oliver Twist, Dickens portrayed London not simply as a city of opportunity, but also as a place where neglect could become a permanent feature of everyday life. Mud-covered streets, filthy alleys, decaying neighbourhoods, children struggling to survive. These were not invented out of thin air. They reflected realities his readers could recognise. Dickens possessed an extraordinary talent for making readers laugh one page and feel quietly uncomfortable the next, rather like Victorian plumbing. His descriptions of London's famous mud became almost symbolic. The endless grime-coating streets represented more than dirt. It represented neglect, a society capable of remarkable achievements while somehow allowing thousands of people to live in conditions that would have horrified previous generations. The reformers did not always agree on every solution. Some emphasised engineering, others focused on housing, others argued for legal reform, better administration or medical advances. But they shared one important belief: the situation could change. That optimism mattered. For centuries, disease had often been accepted as an unavoidable companion of urban life. Floods happened, epidemics happened, people died. What could anyone do? The reformers answered with a remarkably modern response. Quite a lot, actually. Build better sewers, improve drainage, supply clean water, collect rubbish properly, inspect housing, regulate construction, gather evidence, study disease, publish findings, repeat until Parliament finally pays attention. Admittedly, that final step occasionally required the Thames smelling like the end of civilization. Progress was not immediate. Many recommendations were ignored for years. Local authorities complained about costs. Politicians debated responsibilities. Property owners resisted expensive improvements. Nobody enjoys paying for underground pipes, even when the alternative is drinking what used to be inside them. Yet persistence gradually produced results. The Public Health Act of 1848 established a General Board of Health and encouraged improvements in sanitation, although implementation varied widely. Later legislation strengthened local responsibilities for water supply, drainage, and sewage. None of these changes appeared overnight. Each represented years of pressure from people refusing to accept that filth was simply the price of progress. The reformers also demonstrated the growing importance of evidence. Chadwick collected statistics. Mayhew gathered interviews. John Snow mapped cholera deaths. Engineers measured drainage. Scientists investigated contamination. Instead of relying solely upon tradition or assumption, they asked questions. Then they looked for answers. It sounds obvious now. History has an annoying habit of making difficult ideas appear inevitable after someone else has done all the difficult work. As you walk through a cleaner London toward the end of the Victorian period, you begin noticing subtle differences. Streets are gradually improving, sewers expand beneath your feet, water supplies become safer, flood defences grow stronger. The transformation is incomplete. Many neighbourhoods still suffer terribly, but the direction has changed. People have stopped asking whether cities can become healthier. They have begun asking how. That may seem like a small difference. It changes everything. Because once a society accepts that a problem has a solution, ignoring the problem becomes much harder. The flood no longer looks like fate. The epidemic no longer looks inevitable. The overflowing sewer no longer looks permanent. They begin looking instead like failures waiting to be repaired, and perhaps that is the greatest achievement of these reformers. Not that they eliminated filth, not that they ended flooding, not even that they transformed Victorian cities. They convinced millions of people that civilization should aspire to something better than simply hoping the sewage stayed outside until breakfast. A surprisingly ambitious dream, and, considering where this story began, an undeniable improvement. The catastrophic floods and epidemics of the Victorian era didn't just cause suffering, they forced the creation of systems we now take completely for granted. Modern sewage treatment, public health legislation, building codes, dam safety regulations, urban planning, even the basic idea that a government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from preventable disasters. All of these trace their roots directly back to the stinking flooded streets of 19th century Britain. As you leave Victorian Britain behind and quietly return to the present, you begin to notice something strange. Nothing dramatic happens. No fanfare. No orchestra triumphantly celebrating humanity's victory over sewage. Instead, you simply turn on a tap. You flush a toilet. You walk along a street after heavy rain without wondering whether a dead horse is about to float past the bakery. You assume the water disappears because of course it does. That quiet confidence is the true inheritance of the Victorian age. Modern cities are filled with invisible promises. When rain falls, you expect drains to carry it away. When you drink water, you expect it not to contain yesterday's laundry, last week's sewage, and whatever wandered into the river upstream. When you cross a bridge, you assume someone has inspected it recently. When a reservoir sits above a town, you trust that engineers have spent an extraordinary amount of time making sure it stays exactly where it is. Most people never think about these expectations, which is precisely the point. Good infrastructure is almost invisible. The better it works, the less anyone notices it. Victorian Britain learned this lesson through relentless trial and error. Mostly error. Every major flood exposed another weakness. Every cholera outbreak revealed another failure. Every overflowing cesspit quietly announced that pretending not to have a problem was not in fact a sanitation strategy. The response was not immediate. It rarely is. Governments argued, engineers debated, property owners complained about expense, taxpayers wondered why they should fund enormous underground tunnels that nobody would ever admire. It turns out convincing people to pay for sewers has never been an easy political campaign. Perhaps because campaign posters reading "Vote for Better Waste Disposal" struggle to inspire quite the same enthusiasm as almost anything else. Yet gradually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Cleaner water reduced disease, proper drainage reduced flooding, building regulations prevented avoidable disasters, inspections saved lives, planning mattered. One by one, ideas that had once seemed expensive became obvious. One of the greatest transformations involved public health itself. Before the Victorian era, governments generally played a limited role in protecting the health of entire populations. Disease was often viewed as unfortunate, inevitable, or simply beyond meaningful control. The 19th century began changing that assumption. Officials slowly accepted that governments could influence public health through sanitation, clean water, waste removal and housing standards. It was a revolutionary shift. Instead of waiting for epidemics to appear, authorities increasingly attempted to prevent them. A surprisingly efficient approach. Modern sewage treatment owes an enormous debt to Victorian engineering. Bazalgette's sewer network demonstrated that cities required carefully planned systems rather than scattered local solutions. Waste could no longer simply disappear into rivers and hope for the best. Hope, it turns out, is an excellent emotion. It is a terrible filtration system. As scientific understanding improved, cities began treating sewage before releasing it into rivers. Water quality gradually improved. Urban waterways slowly recovered from decades of contamination. Not overnight. Rivers possess remarkably long memories, but they did recover. Building regulations also evolved dramatically. The collapses of dams such as Bilberry Reservoir and Dale Dyke demonstrated that engineering ambition required engineering oversight. Structures holding back enormous quantities of water could not rely upon confidence alone. They required inspection, maintenance standards, independent review. Modern dam safety regulations exist because earlier generations discovered the consequences of not having them, usually at approximately the speed of several 100 million gallons of water. Urban planning changed as well. Victorian cities had expanded so rapidly that roads, housing, drainage and industry often developed without coordinated design. Flooding repeatedly exposed the weaknesses created by that chaotic growth. Later planners began considering elevation, drainage, street layouts, open spaces, and flood risks before construction. Cities slowly transformed from places that simply happened into places that were intentionally designed, at least in theory. Reality occasionally remained determined to improvise. Housing standards improved because reformers demonstrated that damp, overcrowded buildings contributed to disease and suffering. Cellar dwellings gradually disappeared from many cities. Ventilation improved. Access to light became more important. Water supplies became more reliable. People slowly accepted a remarkable idea. Perhaps homes should not regularly fill with sewage. History's greatest breakthroughs are not always glamorous. Sometimes they involve deciding that indoor rivers are less than ideal. The Victorian experience also changed how governments responded to disasters. Although comprehensive emergency management developed much later, 19th century floods highlighted the limitations of relying entirely upon private charity. Communities certainly remained generous. Churches continued helping families. Neighbours still supported one another. But larger disasters revealed that organised public response saved more lives than good intentions alone. Today, emergency planning, evacuation procedures, flood warnings, rescue services, and disaster recovery programs all reflect lessons accumulated over generations. Many of those lessons were written in Victorian mud. Scientific thinking also evolved because of these crises. John Snow's investigation into cholera demonstrated the power of evidence over assumption. Engineers increasingly relied upon measurement rather than instinct. Doctors gradually embraced germ theory. Officials collected statistics. Maps became tools for understanding disease. Observation replaced speculation, not immediately. People rarely surrender comfortable beliefs without a struggle, but eventually, evidence won. The Victorian period reminds you that progress rarely arrives as one dramatic breakthrough. It usually appears as thousands of smaller improvements quietly building upon one another. One better pipe, one stronger dam, one cleaner water supply, one inspector asking uncomfortable questions, one engineer deciding perhaps the tunnel should be made slightly larger than necessary. Future generations rarely remember those decisions individually. They simply inherit the benefits. As you walk through a modern city after heavy rain, you might hear little more than water rushing beneath metal grates before disappearing underground. That ordinary sound contains centuries of accumulated experience. It contains Bazalgette's calculations, Chadwick's reports, Snow's investigations, the labour of countless anonymous workers digging tunnels beneath crowded streets, the painful lessons learned from Holmfirth, the warnings written by Sheffield, the voices of families who lost homes, livelihoods and loved ones. Every functioning drain carries a small piece of that history. There is another irony here. The Victorians often believed they were building the greatest civilization the world had ever seen. In many ways they were, yet their greatest gift to the future was probably not the factories that dominated skylines, or the railways that crossed the countryside. It was the hidden infrastructure beneath their feet. The systems nobody photographs, the tunnels nobody visits, the pipes nobody applauds. Civilization, it turns out, depends less upon magnificent monuments than upon making absolutely certain that yesterday's sewage does not become tomorrow's drinking water. It is a disappointingly unromantic truth. It is also one of humanity's finest achievements. So as you leave these flooded streets behind, take one final look at the Thames. Imagine its foul smell slowly fading. Imagine children growing up in healthier neighbourhoods. Imagine epidemics becoming less frequent. Imagine engineers quietly checking dams before anyone notices a crack. Imagine rain falling onto a great city and disappearing exactly where it should. The Victorians paid dearly for those ordinary moments. Their flooded basements, poisoned wells, collapsing reservoirs, and disease-ridden streets became the tuition fees for the modern world. Which means the next time you complain that a storm has delayed your commute by 10 minutes, remember this. At least your morning does not begin with rowing a boat down the high street while wondering whether the river has thoughtfully delivered your neighbour's cesspit into your sitting room. By Victorian standards, that counts as remarkable progress. By the final decades of the 19th century, the worst was over for most of Britain's major cities. Bazalgette's sewers were working. The embankments held, mostly. Cholera had retreated. Dam engineering had improved. But the threat never fully disappeared. The Thames continued to flood periodically, and in 1928 it would breach the embankments one last time, killing 14 people and reminding London that no wall, no matter how well built, could tame a river forever. As you linger for one last moment beside the Thames, the city feels different from the one where your journey began. The smell has changed. The river no longer assaults your senses before you even catch sight of it. The endless stream of sewage has been intercepted. The great brick sewers beneath your feet quietly carry away what London once dumped directly into the water. The elegant embankments stand between the streets and the tide like patient stone guardians. For the first time in generations, the city feels as though it has finally caught its breath. Not perfect, never perfect, but undeniably better. That improvement did not arrive through luck. It arrived because thousands of engineers, labourers, doctors, reformers, politicians, and ordinary citizens slowly accepted an uncomfortable truth. Civilizations cannot simply build factories, banks, and grand museums while pretending the drains will somehow organise themselves. Someone has to think about where the water goes, and perhaps more importantly, where it absolutely should not. Walking through London near the end of the Victorian era, you notice something remarkable. You stop noticing. The drains work. The streets remain drier after storms. The drinking water is cleaner. Children survive diseases that once devastated entire neighbourhoods. Markets bustle. Ships continue arriving. Life carries on. The greatest compliment anyone can pay a sewer system is forgetting it exists. Bazalgette would probably have considered that a triumph. Success in public health is wonderfully boring. Nobody throws parades because cholera failed to appear this summer. Nobody writes poems celebrating effective drainage. The newspapers rarely print triumphant headlines announcing that absolutely nothing catastrophic happened this week. Human beings are strangely poor at celebrating disasters that never occur. Perhaps because nothing happening makes for rather disappointing conversation. How was your day? Exceptionally uneventful. The reservoir remained precisely where engineers intended. Splendid. The Victorians built systems designed to disappear into the background. Invisible infrastructure became the foundation upon which visible civilization could flourish. The brick tunnels beneath London quietly performed their work day after day. Water flowed, waste disappeared, disease declined, life expectancy gradually improved. Children who might once have died during repeated epidemics now reached adulthood. Entire generations grew up without fully appreciating just how extraordinary that change really was. History has a peculiar habit of making success look inevitable. It rarely was. Yet for all this progress, the Thames never surrendered completely. It remained a tidal river connected to the sea, influenced by storms, rainfall, and the powerful pull of the moon. Engineers had reduced the danger. They had not abolished nature. From time to time, high tides still tested London's defences. Storm surges still pushed enormous volumes of water upstream. Heavy rainfall continued filling tributaries. The river waited patiently. It had nowhere else to be. Then came the winter of 1928. Although beyond the Victorian era itself, the disaster served as a sobering reminder of everything the 19th century had learned. On the night of the 6th and 7th of January, an unusually high tide combined with a powerful storm surge moving down the North Sea. Water levels rose dramatically along the Thames. Sections of the embankments and riverside defences were overtopped, particularly in low-lying parts of London. 14 people lost their lives. Many drowned in basement dwellings remarkably similar to those that had plagued the Victorian poor decades earlier. It was a cruel echo from the past. The city had changed enormously. The river had not forgotten its old habits. You can almost imagine the Thames clearing its throat after several decades of relatively good behaviour. Do not become too confident. I am still here. The flood of 1928 shocked London precisely because so much progress had already been made. People had begun trusting the city's defences. The embankments symbolised security. The great sewer network represented modern engineering at its finest. Then the river reminded everyone that engineering is not magic. It is preparation. Preparation greatly improves your chances. It does not negotiate with gravity. The disaster encouraged further improvements to London's flood defences during the 20th century. Engineers studied water levels more carefully. River management continued evolving. Better forecasting gradually became possible. Eventually, concerns about increasingly severe storm surges led to one of Britain's greatest engineering achievements, the Thames Barrier. Completed in the late 20th century, it stands downstream of central London, its enormous movable gates capable of closing when dangerous tides threaten the city. In a way, it is Basil Gett's philosophy carried forward another 100 years. Observe the problem, study the evidence, build something magnificent, preferably before the next flood arrives. The barrier exists because every generation inherits both the successes and the unfinished work of the generation before it. Victorian engineers solved the problems they understood. Later engineers solved new ones revealed by changing conditions. Future engineers will almost certainly face challenges we have not yet imagined. That is the quiet rhythm of civilization. No generation finishes the job completely. They simply leave the next generation a slightly better starting point. As you think back across this entire journey, certain images return. The overflowing cesspits, the cellar dwellings, children sleeping below street level while groundwater crept through the walls, night soil men climbing into pits no reasonable person would willingly enter, Jon Snow removing the handle from the Broad Street pump, Basil Gett sketching vast networks of brick tunnels beneath London, the terrible roar of water racing through Holmfirth and Sheffield, the endless mud coating every floor after the floods had gone. The smell, always the smell. Each story seemed separate while you were living through it, yet they were all connected. Floods revealed weaknesses, disease exposed hidden dangers, engineers created solutions, reformers demanded change, journalists described what others wished to ignore, scientists questioned accepted beliefs, ordinary families endured the consequences while history slowly caught up. Civilization rarely advances in straight lines. More often, it stumbles through disasters while taking increasingly detailed notes. There is something strangely comforting about that. Human beings make astonishing mistakes. We also possess an equally astonishing ability to learn from them, eventually. Usually after considerable argument, and occasionally after someone has accidentally floated down the high street in a bathtub. Standing beside the Thames now, you hear only the gentle movement of the tide against the embankment. People stroll along tree-lined walkways, boats pass peacefully beneath bridges, office workers hurry home without giving the river a second thought. Most never wonder what lies beneath their feet. Miles upon miles of brick tunnels, pipes, pumps, foundations, the hidden skeleton of a modern city. That hidden world exists because countless Victorians lived through circumstances most of us can scarcely imagine. They endured epidemics, they survived floods, they buried loved ones, they demanded better. And because they did, millions of people today can complain about entirely different inconveniences. Slow internet, late trains, coffee that is not quite hot enough. History has been remarkably generous. So as the evening settles over the Thames and the city grows quiet, you can finally leave these flooded streets behind. You have walked through overflowing gutters, drowned valleys, cellar homes, disease-ridden neighbourhoods, and ambitious engineering projects that changed the course of history. You have watched a great city nearly poison itself before discovering that intelligence, persistence, and an almost unreasonable number of bricks could accomplish extraordinary things. The river is calmer now. The city is stronger. Neither has won completely. Perhaps neither ever will, because the oldest lesson the Thames ever taught London is also the simplest. You may build walls, you may dig tunnels, you may spend generations mastering water, but every so often the river will lift an eyebrow, rise with the tide, and gently remind you that nature has been practicing this particular hobby for a few million years longer than you have.